Hellenic History by George Willis Botsford. Chapter 6. Crete, Lacedaemon, and the Peloponnesian League. 1. Crete. City-states and their federation. Of the 100 Cretan cities existing in the Middle Age, at least 50 survived to historical time, or were replaced by newer foundations, and are known by name. They joined in a league to resist invasion and established a federal court for the settlement of their disputes. Notwithstanding these institutions, the city-states often fought with one another. The most important were Knossos, Gortyn, and Cydonia, which, when combined, were able to control the policy of the rest. Social classes. Because of the relatively small number of Hellenic immigrants into Crete, Minoan institutions as well as Minoan art survived to historical time with less modification than elsewhere. The Lyctians, says Aristotle, are a colony of the Lacedaemonians, and the colonists, when they came to Crete, adopted the laws which they found existing among the inhabitants. Ephorus too holds the opinion that the institutions which were accustomed to describe as peculiarly Dorian existed in the native cities of Crete before the Dorian immigration. Society in Lyctus and elsewhere was organized in stereotyped classes, such as we expect to find in any old, stagnant civilization. Most bought slaves were in the cities, employed in domestic service. Higher in rank were the serfs, some public, others private. These slaves, serfs, have some regularly recurring festivals in Cydonia, during which no free men enter the city, but the slaves are masters of everything, and have the right even to flog the free men. Their family and business rights were extensive, and they were carefully protected by law. Among the freemen were various social grades. Lowest were the perioeci, dwellers around, the inhabitants of a city in subjection to another. We know little of their condition. The citizens of a free state were by birth either common or noble. All were alike warriors living in the city, and differentiated from the farming class by a law of Minos. The most important features of their life were their military education and their public tables. Training of children and youths. The children were taught to read, to sing the traditional songs, and to play the double pipe and lyre, two instruments inherited from Minoan time. At an early age, they were taken to the public tables to wait on their fathers. Clad in mean garments which were rarely changed, they ate their food together, sitting on the ground. The boys attached to each table were organized in a company under a master. The groups thus formed took rudimentary training for war, and fought sham battles. When they reached the 17th year, they were organized in troops, each under the leadership of a noble youth, whose father supervised this training and enforced discipline. On certain appointed days, troop encounters troop, marching in time to the sound of pipe and lyre, as is their custom in actual war. All the members who have reached the required age are compelled to marry. They do not bring their brides home forthwith, but wait till the latter are able to attend to household matters. The dowry of a girl is equal to half of her brother's portion. Evidently the troop was the company which sat at one table. The messes of the older men were called simply clubs, evidently transformed from the troops of youth. Public tables. The limited number of citizens in a state is proved by the fact that the tables were under a single roof. Each table was in charge of a woman, who, with the help of common laborers and slaves, prepared and served the food, giving the choicest dishes to the citizens most distinguished for wisdom and prowess. An ancient authority informs us that the people of Lyctai conduct their public tables as follows. Each brings in a tenth of his produce, as well as the public revenues, which the authorities of the state distribute among the several houses. Each slave, too, contributes monthly an aeginetan stater as poll tax. This arrangement conduced to equality, as state aid permitted the poorest citizens to eat at the public tables. Military and religious aspects of the training. The object of their peculiar mode of life was military. That courage and not fear might predominate, they accustomed themselves from childhood to the use of arms and to endure fatigue. Accordingly, they disregarded heat and cold, rugged and steep roads, blows received in gymnastic exercises and in set battles. They practiced archery, and the curates, young men initiated into the mysteries of Zeus, the divine youth, performed the Pyrrhic war dance in armor, while they chanted a song to the Lord of all that is wet and gleaming, praying for full jars, fleecy flocks, fruitful fields, prosperous sea-borne ships, and goodly law. Political development. The original kingship changed to an aristocracy, in which the chief magistrates were 10 cosmi, keepers of order, who commanded in war, exercised judicial and general administrative functions, and enforced discipline among the citizens. They were assisted and limited by a council and an assembly. At an early period, the laws were reduced to writing. A considerable part of the Code of Gortyn has been preserved in an inscription. Gradually, the government grew more popular, till in the 3rd century democracy became universal. 2. Lacedaemon. Political unification of Laconia. In Laconia, conditions were in some respects similar to those of Crete. Although probably a larger percentage of the Laconians were of northern descent, yet their civilization owed more to the Minoans than to the Indo-European race. Unlike Crete, Laconia contained one city-state, Sparta, which excelled all the rest in military power. Advantageously located near the center of the country, and probably commanding a wider area and larger population than any other, well invigorated too with northern blood. This city brought all Laconia under her power, 8th century. Adjacent communities she absorbed, and reduced the others to subjection as perioeci. The nearer result was increased wealth and temporarily a richer culture for the dominant state, but more enduringly the growth of the strongest military power in Hellas. Laconian culture of the 7th century. Earlier in the 7th century, the commercial relations of Sparta with the Asiatic Greeks bore cultural fruit. On invitation, the lesbian musician Terpander came with his 7-string Cretan lyre to Sparta to allay a political disturbance. The Greeks were far more sensitive to music than we are, and it is impossible for us to appreciate the moral effect of hortative verse sung to a strange and masterful melody. Shortly afterward, Thaletas of Gortyn, invited by the Spartans to visit their city, brought with him the choral song and dance. The word chorus applied originally to the dancing place, then to the group of performers, and finally to their song. The Pyrrhic war dance he is said to have invented. However that may be, he introduced it into Sparta. In music, the Spartan found a powerful instrument for training, and no state employed it with equal success. Later in the century, we find Alcman active at Sparta. A hint from an extant fragment has led to the view that he was a Lydian from Sardis. At all events, he speaks the Doric tongue, and identifies himself heart and soul with the natives. His poems open to us a view of Spartan life which we find nowhere else, a life of contentment, of peace and love and pleasure. From the gods is vengeance, but he is happy who cheerily weaves the web of his days unweeping. He invites to Laconia the goddess Aphrodite, leaving her lovely Cyprus and Paphos encircled by waves. He calls upon the muse of sweet voice, daughter of Zeus, to begin the delightful melody, adding charm to the song, and inspiring the graceful dance of fair-gowned girls with their carven ivory necklets. These sentiments of his, and many more, no less gentle, were in keeping with the Laconia of his age. We come to great Demeter's fane, we 9, all maidens, all in goodly raiment clad. In goodly raiment clad, with necklets bright, of carven ivory that shone like snow. First Messenian War. In a general way we have traced the history of Laconia through the Middle Age to its acme of cultural development in the 7th century. The conquest of this country by Sparta was connected closely as effect and cause with the growth in that city of a ruling military class of landowners, supported by agricultural serfs, helots, a social system derived from Minoan life. Having nothing to do but drill and fight, the military class naturally developed an ambitious policy of conquest. Toward the close of the 8th century, they had waged a war of aggression upon Messenia. The population of this country at the time was Achaean, a blend of aborigines with early Greek-speaking immigrants, among whom doubtless Dorians had already settled. Whatever the pretext for the war may have been, the Spartan poet Tyrtaeus gives a real motive as a desire to plough and plant fertile Messenia. The same poet who, living shortly after the time, is our only reliable authority for the event, tells us that for 19 years the fathers of our fathers, warriors stout of heart, fought unresting to possess her, and in the 20th the foemen, forsaking their rich fields, fled from the lofty heights of Mount Ithome. Many of the conquered were reduced to serfdom. Like asses worn with heavy loads, bitterly are they forced to bring their master the half of all the soil produces, and whenever the baleful fate of death overtakes their lord, they and their wives must needs join in lamenting him. Second Messenian War, about 650. After this conquest we hear of other Lacedaemonian wars with neighbors, not all so fortunate. There were too internal disturbances which detracted from the reputation of the state. Taking advantage of their weakness, the Messenians, supported by Argives, Arcadians, and Pisatans, revolted. In their first struggle with this powerful coalition, the Lacedaemonians were beaten and lost courage. It was the most critical period of their early history. Wealth, art, poetry, the refinements of life, had developed here as nowhere in the peninsula. In the pursuit of culture and comfort, the Spartans were fast losing their warlike character. It was under these untoward conditions that Tyrtaeus came forward to inspire and guide. He was not merely a poet, but a statesman and a military leader, as was Solon shortly afterward at Athens. Through his generalship, the Laconians conquered Messenia. In battle songs, he roused his countrymen to fight and die, if need be, for the fatherland, setting before them as an alternative to victory a life of wandering beggary. A noble thing it is to die a valiant man, falling in the front line of warriors, in the battle for the fatherland. Most grievous of all fates is to leave one's city and fertile fields, and to wander begging with a dear mother and aged father, and little children and wedded wife. After a long hard struggle, the Messenians who failed to escape from the country resumed the yoke of serfdom. Conquest and the land system. In her earlier conquests, Sparta had readily admitted the higher class to citizenship, on condition of removing to the governing city. In this way, all central Laconia became the private property of the Spartan citizens, and when Messenia was subdued, the Spartans distributed among themselves a broad district extending through the center of that country to the western coast. All the towns disappeared from this region, as they had disappeared from central Laconia. The lot assigned the individual Spartan was of such a size as to supply him with 70 medimi of barley, and his wife with 12, and oil and wine in proportion. The farms thus granted by the state were hereditary and inalienable. Other lands were freely bought and sold, and in time it became permissible to give away or bequeath the hereditary lot. The result was that differences in wealth arose among the Spartans. As the citizens were forbidden to engage in trade of every kind, their only lawful source of income was agriculture and grazing. Having originally adopted iron as money, as had various other Greek states, at a time when this metal was still scarce, they were compelled by law to adhere to it, centuries after silver and gold had elsewhere become current. In Laconia, as in Minoan Crete, the ruling community tended to make of itself a military caste, on the basis of a socialism rigorously enforced by the state. At first, liberal with the citizenship, the Spartans in time hedged themselves strictly in, refusing except on the rarest occasions to admit a stranger to their political community, and ruling in a lordly spirit over their subjects. The elements of social and governmental system derived from the Minoans. They gradually, 1,000 to 600, adapted to their own requirements, and the discipline, described in the following pages, did not become severe till the 6th century. To maintain their social and political superiority, the Spartans constituted themselves as a perpetual army, and transformed their city into a camp. Their whole life was occupied with training. This principle controlled marriage, the birth and education of children, economy and occupation, in brief, every activity of life. In other countries of Greece, custom gave the father the option of rearing his child, or of putting it to death immediately after birth. In Sparta, this function was usurped by the elders of the tribe. If they found the infant weak or deformed, they ordered it exposed in a glen of Mount Taygetus. If, however, he reached the standard of strength and shapeliness, they directed the father to rear him. To the 7th year, children were in the care of their mothers and of nurses, who were competent women, strictly supervised by the state. The child was trained to eat coarse food without complaint, to cultivate bravery and a cheerful disposition. On reaching the age of 7, he was taken from his mother and placed directly under the control of the state. In the organization of these boys in troops, under youthful captains of prudence and daring, for athletic and military drill, and in their education in reading and music, there was a thoroughgoing similarity to Cretan conditions already described. It was not often that the Spartan boys were permitted to bathe or anoint themselves with oil. They had no bedclothing, but slept in their companies on piles of rushes they had gathered from the banks of the Eurotas. Under the direction of their captain they cooked their own meals, the bigger boys bringing logs for the fire, the smaller gathering pot herbs. They contributed also what they had stolen from the gardens or from the tables of the men. Theft was encouraged as an exercise in agility and cleverness. One caught in the act was punished for clumsiness by flogging and fasting. Their meals were purposely made scant, as an inducement to ingenuity in providing extras, and as means of developing tall, slender bodies. Once a year the supreme test of endurance was applied, when at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the great Minoan goddess, the boys submitted to a flogging. Some endured to death. The severe training resulted not only in strength, agility, and endurance, but also in a quiet, modest bearing, which has no parallel in modern life. The young Spartans walked the streets, their hands within the folds of their cloaks, their gaze fixed on the ground before them. You might sooner expect a stone image to find voice than one of these Spartan youths. To divert the eye of a bronze statue were less difficult. Barrack life. At the age of 20, the youth became a man liable to service in the field. It was now permitted him to marry, but for a long time he could see his wife only by stealth. In fact, he never had the enjoyment of a home, but passed his entire life in military drill, eating and sleeping in the barracks. At the age mentioned, he joined a secession mess. It comprised about 15 members who filled vacancies by co-optation. Their ballots were breadcrumbs, and so great a value did they set on unanimity that a single adverse ballot sufficed to debar a candidate. Each member contributed his monthly share of barley, wine, cheese, and figs, with a little cash for luxuries. Their meat was chiefly pork and wild game. The former was an ingredient of their famous black broth. If you should live in Lacedaemon's bounds, you must comply with all the fashions there, go to their spare fiditia for supper, and feast on their black broth and not disdain, to wear fierce whiskers and seek no indulgence further than this, but keep the old customs, such as their country doth compel. Mature men. At 30 the Spartan became a mature man, privileged to attend the assembly and to fill such political offices as required no advanced age qualification. Continuing their military exercises, the men passed the remainder of their time in the gymnasia and clubs or at the Syssitia, discoursing in brief laconic satire, not on money and business matters, but on the honorable and base. The austerities of life found relief in the merriment of wine parties. Among the images of their deities was a little statue of the god of laughter. The severity was mitigated too in campaigns, which accordingly seemed to them a relief from the labors of peace. Girls and women. Girls underwent a similar training. They too practiced running, wrestling, leaping, and throwing the discus and spear, contending for prizes in these sports before the assembled citizens. The state required such exercises, as it considered health and strength in women essential to the physical perfection of the race. Their presence at the competition of youths with approval and raillery incited to the utmost the development of the contestants' energy and skill. The women had a part as well in many religious festivals. The Parthenia of Alcman are choral songs for girls, who in the ambrosial night bear a mantle to Artemis as a gift, while the stars contend with them in beauty, and streaming tresses grace the leader like gold unalloyed. In nimbleness, strength, and loveliness of form, these athletic girls are like steeds compactly built, that win the prize with ringing hoofs, creatures of winged dreams. Thus Alcman sings. Married women. Their training continued only till marriage. The chief wedding rite was a pretended abduction of the bride by force, a relic of the primitive custom of marriage by actual capture. While their husbands lived in the barracks, they enjoyed leisure and comparative luxury at home. Through dowries and inheritances, they gradually accumulated property, till, in the time of Aristotle, they owned nearly 2/5 of the land. This accumulation of wealth in their hands, under conditions as they existed in Laconia, tended to impoverish the men, to lessen the number who had the means of performing citizen duties, hence to weaken the state. Having greater leisure, the women probably attained to a higher intellectual level than their husbands. We hear much, too, of their patriotism. They held up before husband, son, or father the high Spartan standard of honesty and valor. In all Greece, the women of Sparta alone ruled the men. Yet, notwithstanding the praises of other writers, Aristotle lays severe strictures on their character, and it may well be that they deteriorated before his age. So degenerate were they in the 4th century, as to prove in time of invasion a greater mischief even than the enemy, a self-imposed socialistic despotism. We find accordingly at Sparta a socialistic community under a self-imposed despotism, which sacrificed the individual to the ideal good of the state, which eradicated the family with its powerful moral influence, and robbed marriage of its sanctity, compelling all the young to regard the elders as their parents, and making it a function of the older people to admonish and to chastise the younger as their children. By limiting education almost exclusively to physical exercise, the system tended to stunt the intellect and the imagination. These defects, however, showed themselves but gradually, with the lapse of centuries. Social classes. Among the Spartans were degrees of rank. Highest in nobility were the two royal families, from whom respectively were taken the two kings. Below were other hereditary nobles, who alone were qualified for membership in the Gerousia, Senate Council. Still lower were the mass of commons, whose means enabled them to contribute to the Syssitia, and who were physically able to undergo the training. All who had these qualifications were peers. Those who failed in either respect were inferiors. The latter were undoubtedly debarred from political rights, which, however, they could resume on making good the deficiency. Helots. Reference has incidentally been made to the Helots, who were serfs like those of Crete. Most probably they originated in a class of Minoan serfs, increased by conquest, perhaps too in early time by debt and oppression, till finally they came to be many times their master in number. They were assigned to the lands of the citizens, who were forbidden to enfranchise them or to sell them outside the country. The idea was that they belonged to the state rather than to the individual. They lived with their families in cottages on the lots assigned to them, rendered to their masters the amount of produce fixed by law, and kept the rest for themselves. In fruitful years they could save something, which they occasionally increased by labor for others or by plunder in war, with the result that many acquired considerable estates. In addition to tilling the soil, they aided in preparing their masters' meals, and performed any other menial labor imposed by their individual lords or by the state. In war they served as light troops, or as oarsmen in the fleet, attended to the wounded, and waited on their masters. When required to serve in the heavy infantry, as often happened in the Peloponnesian War, the meritorious were rewarded with freedom. Freedmen. We hear of several kinds of degrees of freedmanship without being able to define them all. The Neodamodes, new citizens, performed military duty but lacked the franchise. The Mothones formed a large class, many of whom seem to have been children of Spartan fathers and Helot mothers. They were brought up as foster brothers of the youths. Though lacking political rights, they were personally free and shared in the Spartan training. Some became prominent in military offices and acquired the full citizenship. The policy of degrading the Helots, notwithstanding favors thus occasionally received, the condition of the Helots was wretched. They were kept in mind of their servitude by the clothes they wore, a dogskin cap and a mantle of sheepskin, girded at the waist by a broad belt. The same dress, it is true, was worn from primitive times by free rural laborers in other parts of Hellas, but this circumstance did nothing to mitigate the contrast in Lacedaemon between serfs and lords. Whereas the Spartans were forbidden sweetmeats and excessive drinking, and all immoral songs, they would not permit the Helots to sing the noble lays of the great national poets, but compelled them on occasions to make an exhibition of intoxication, and of their low melodies and dances, as a warning to the Spartan youth to beware of such practices. The Cryptia. To overawe the Helots and keep them in a spirit of subjection, the government instituted a secret police force, termed Cryptia, comprising the most prudent young men of Sparta. Armed with daggers, these policemen were accustomed to range through the country. Concealing themselves in the daytime and traveling by night, they used to cut down any helot to whom suspicion attached. To avoid incurring thus the guilt of murder, says Aristotle, the ephors were accustomed every year on entering office to proclaim war upon the helots. The Spartan domain and the surrounding Perioki. Spartans and helots have been considered in connection because of their interdependence as lords and serfs, as well as because of their local relations. Helots were only found in the homes and on the lands of the Spartans. Extending nearly around this domain was a strip of territory occupied by the Perioki, dwellers around. They lived in towns or cities, polis, of their own, about 100 in number. Many were originally free, but had been reduced to dependence by Sparta. It is equally clear that many were colonies formed by Sparta, in part with immigrants from other countries. The object of the Spartans in thus surrounding their domain with a chain of colonies is evident. In the first place, they wished in this way to provide a defense for their territory. More important was their desire to cut off the helots from the outside world, leaving the neighbors no opportunity to interfere and the helots no hope of escape. In return for the favor shown them by Sparta, the Perioki thus stood guards over the serfs. The Periokic towns. Each Periokic town had its own government, usually immune from Spartan interference. The inhabitants were personally free, and as in any Greek state were divided into nobles and commons. Their equality with other Greeks is shown by the part they took as competitors in the great national games. Not subject to the Spartan discipline, they enjoyed a relatively large liberty in the employment of their time and in the choice of occupations. Many were farmers, but as the best lands had been taken by the ruling people, a great number devoted themselves to manufacturing and commerce. They worked the iron mines of Mount Taygetus and manufactured various iron and steel fabrics, such as keys, swords, helmets, and axes. As workers in bronze, they showed artistic taste. We hear of their drinking cups, their shoes, chairs, tables, and chariots. Some manufactured sea purple, with which they dyed woolen garments. Commerce brought them wealth, for their wares were in high favor throughout the world. They were not without intellectual eminence, for they gave several poets to Hellas, and their wisest man, Meson, was reckoned among the 7 sages. They had their religious festivals, in which the Spartans enjoyed a part, as at the annual national celebration to Artemis at Caria, where the Lacedaemonian girls joined in the dance. Relation of the Perioki to Sparta. The towns themselves were individually subject to Sparta, evidently on fixed terms. Spartan citizens were not permitted to reside or possess property within a Periokic town, whereas the Perioki were privileged to reside in Sparta for the sake of conducting business there. They paid the ruling city contributions in the time of need, and in war performed military duty. Their heavy infantry was only less efficient than the Spartan. The arsenals and warships of Lacedaemon were theirs, though necessarily under Spartan command, and they formed a considerable part of the crews. In army and navy, Men of this class rose by merit to high positions. None, however, obtained access to the Spartan citizenship, or shared in the Lacedaemonian government, or in any way influenced its policy. And yet, in the Lacedaemonian state, they were not regarded as aliens. They, with the Spartans, constituted the Lacedaemonians, citizens of several cities included in the state, whereas the Helots before emancipation were excluded from the name and civil rights. The amount of Spartan interference in their local affairs was variable. Because of its exposed position, Cythera was occupied by a garrison under a Harmost, associated with a civil magistrate. Other towns were ordinarily liable to occupation only when threatened by an enemy. Contented with their lot, the Perioeci long remained faithful. With the progress of time, however, as the number of Spartans dwindled, the burden of service fell more and more heavily upon them. Then, first, they became dissatisfied with their condition. The amount of personal liberty which the Perioeci continued to enjoy was great. Those who so lived as to incur no political suspicion were secure enough in life and property. Yet this condition existed on sufferance only, for the ephors had a right to arrest and put to death, without trial, any Perioecus whom they judged dangerous. This power was moderately exercised, and the bond of interest and sympathy which united the Perioeci to Sparta remained strong. The Lacedaemonian Army. The primary aim of the social organization and discipline was the military superiority of Sparta. The germ of her phalanx was a Minoan inheritance fostered 1. By her rapidly grown exclusiveness, 2. By the superior fertility and extent of her original territory, supporting a remarkably large number of landowners of sufficient means to enable them to equip themselves for heavy infantry service. 3. By the absence of an acropolis of imposing height, to exercise a moral power of protective control over the neighborhood, compelling an unusual dependence on the strong military arm. In the time of Terteus, the phalanx had not reached its complete development. As yet, the warrior held no fixed position, but it greatly depended on his own courage, whether he would fight in the front rank among the champions, or farther back in the lines, or stand far off beyond the range of darts. It was meritorious in the young men to take the front rank. Some were heavy infantry and others light. The heavy footmen wore a helmet with lofty crest, a great shield covering breast, body, hips and legs, or in its place a round embossed shield with a cuirass beneath. For offense they carried swords and long lances. The light troops, crouching beneath their bucklers in loose formation, hurled stones from slings and threw their polished javelins. The metal of the protecting armor was bronze, whereas their weapons of offense were probably now of iron, which the mines of Laconia abundantly furnished. In time, the citizen body of light troops was eliminated, and the heavy armed were organized in 5 morae, from the 5 local tribes into which the Spartans came to be divided. A 6th mora, as a guard for the kings, seems to have been formed from all 5 tribes. As the number of Spartans declined, the vacant places in the mora were filled with Perioeci, whereas The helots usually served as light troops or as mere laborers. The military age extended from the 20th to the 60th year. The kings, the commanders of the army, and in the earliest known constitution the chief magistrates, were the two kings, from the royal families of the Agiads and Eurypontids respectively. Whatever may have been the origin of the double kingship, the institution was looked upon as a safeguard against tyranny. The perpetual discord between the kings weakened their office, permitting the growth of more popular institutions. The kings were priests of Zeus and certain other gods and judges, in cases concerning family law and public highways. As commanders of the army, they originally had the right to declare war against whatsoever enemy they pleased. But this and other powers were gradually taken from them. In war and peace, they received fixed portions of the sacrificial victims, and in general enjoyed many privileges and honors. Their persons were sacred, and after death they received worship as heroes. On the decease of a king, women went about the streets beating on copper kettles, while mounted messengers spread the news throughout Laconia and Messenia. Representatives of every household, of every social class, under penalty of the law, gathered to mourn the dead. Like Asiatics on similar occasions, the assembled thousands, men and women, intermingled, beat their foreheads with a right good will, and make lamentation without stint, saying this one who died last of their kings was the best of all. Here doubtless survived the shred of their pomp and ceremony practiced by their ancestry, on the Minoan side centuries earlier at the beehive tombs. The council, Gerousia. The Gerousia, council of old men, was composed of 28 elders and the two kings. The former were chosen from a few noble gentes. They were required to have reached the age of 60, and to have gained distinction for sobriety, virtue, and wisdom. The mode of election was peculiar. Candidates for the vacant place walked through the assembly one by one, in an order previously determined by lot, receiving as they passed the acclamation of the people. The members of the returning board, supposed to be ignorant of the order in which the candidates presented themselves, were secreted in a room nearby, where they could hear without seeing. By the loudness and extent of the acclamation, they determined which was the more popular, and therefore the successful candidate. The idea seems to have been that the will of the people expressed itself, not by a majority of votes, but by the intensity of feeling on the part of the assembly as a whole. This method, which Aristotle describes as childish, readily admitted connivance between the council and the returning board, for thwarting the popular will. The functions of the Gerousia were like those of the Homeric council, but far more definite. It considered measures to be presented to the assembly, and assisted the chief magistrates in the management of public affairs. It exercised jurisdiction in cases affecting the life or civil status of the citizens, and in all important criminal cases in which citizens were involved. The presidency of the body, originally belonging to the kings, was in time transferred to the ephors, the popular assembly, appella. The appella, popular assembly, comprised the fully privileged citizens 30 years of age and upward, who served in the heavy infantry. Under the presidency of the kings, afterward of the ephors, it elected magistrates, decided questions concerning the succession of kings, and accepted or rejected the measures which the magistrates and council rarely brought before it. As at Rome, the members of the assembly had no right to initiate measures or to join in the debate. They were strictly limited to listening and voting. Everywhere in Hellas, however, the supreme political authority rested ultimately with the dominant military class, and at Sparta, accordingly, it was vested in the assembly of heavy infantry. This body it was which wrested the supreme power from the kings. The assembly did not exercise its authority directly, however, but devolved it upon a board of 5 ephors, elected annually from the qualified citizens. Only in questions of war, peace, and other matters of unusual importance did it reserve the right of decision. The government was a broad military aristocracy, tempered by a strong magistracy. The ephors. The ephors, overseers, evidently existed from very early time, but only with the lapse of centuries did they come to supersede the kings as the heads of the state. On entering office, they issued this edict: shave their moustaches and obey the laws, that they may not be grievous to you. The first part of the order enforced the custom which we find pictured on their monuments. The second commanded subjection to discipline. These magistrates supervised the training of youths and watched over the conduct of the citizens through their entire lives. They acquired the right to preside over the gerousia and the appella, to try nearly all the civil cases, and to prosecute criminals before the council of elders. Over helots they exercised absolute power, and in cases of political emergency they could put a periocus to death untried. Their authority extended over the kings. At the close of every 9-year period of a king's reign, they watched the sky for no man, which, if found, deposed him. Oftener, by threats of prosecution for misconduct, they drove him into exile. As heads of the state, they conducted negotiations with other governments. These powers, and many others of slightly less importance, they had gradually acquired before the opening of the 4th century. 3. Argos, Lacedaemon, and the Peloponnesian League. Argos. In the day of their glory, the kings of Mycenae and Argos governed a broad mainland realm and claimed hegemony over many islands. With the decline of Minoan civilization and the immigration of northwestern Greeks, their power declined, and in the territory once subject to them, many cities, old and new, maintained their independence. Such was the condition of Argolis when Phaedon, king, or some say tyrant, ascended the throne. His reign cannot be certainly dated, and his achievements display a semi-mythical color. On the whole, it seems to accord best with the few known facts to place him near the middle of the 7th century, prior to the Second Messenian War. It was his achievement to concentrate all Argolis under his authority, to extend his sway northward over Corinth and Aegina and southward over Kenuria, the narrow strip of land between Mount Parnon and the sea, continuing in the island of Cythera. Probably it was he who led the Argives to an overwhelming victory over the Lacedaemonians at Hysiae. Then he invaded Elis, expelled its magistrates from the presidency of the Olympic Games, and assumed that office himself. This act is characterized by Herodotus as extreme insolence. By spreading abroad over Peloponnese the system of measures already in vogue in Aegina, he left a permanent impress of his name on that part of Greece. His imposing personality shed a sunset glow upon the departing glory of his city. While bidding fair to become the arbiter of Hellas, he was dislodged from his hold on Olympia by a coalition of Lacedaemonians and Eleans, and his death finally put an end to the hopes he had raised. His successor on the throne was a weakling, who enjoyed scarcely more than the name of sovereign. Argos was consequently in no position to set bounds to the expanding power of Lacedaemon. Arcadia. The ambition of the Spartans first directed itself northward. There was the tableland of Arcadia, surmounted by high mountain ranges, which divided the country into a number of basins. In each basin dwelt a canton comprising several villages. These mountaineers were simple folk, liberty-loving, unpolished, and warlike. Only on the eastern border did cities grow up under the cultural influence of Argos. Here were 3 city-states, Tegea, Orchomenus, and Mantinea. No political bond united the Arcadians, but an ethnic sympathy found nurture at their common shrine of Zeus at Lycosura, where they joined in festive worship. Without definite knowledge, the student of history yet gains the impression that they possessed means of common action in war. In their conflict with Laconia, they seem to have followed the lead of Tegea, their most powerful state. Lacedaemon wins the headship of Arcadia, 600 to 550. The Lacedaemonians, after their conquest of Messenia, could not long remain at peace with the world. Their numbers were still doubtless increasing, and they coveted more lands and helots. Their social-political organization, framed exclusively for war, could find nurture in nothing but conquest. Their kings accordingly sent to consult the oracle of Delphi on the prospect of conquering all Arcadia. The prophetess answered, "The land of Arcadia, thou askest too much, I refuse it. Many there are in Arcadian land, stout men, eating acorns. They will prevent thee from this, but I am not grudging toward thee. Tegea, beaten with sounding feet, I will give thee to dance in, and a fair plain I will give thee, to measure with line and divide it." Trusting to this deceitful oracle, they concentrated their strength against Tegea. But they were beaten, and the captives taken were compelled to work the fields of Tegea, wearing the fetters they had brought with them for shackling conquered Arcadians. Several times, while gaining success elsewhere, they tried in vain to conquer Tegea. Finally they won a victory over that state, but not such as to promise a conquest. Originally they had planned to helotize the Tegeans, but now they were content to form a permanent alliance with them, about 550. Following this example, the Arcadian cantons, one by one, entered into league with Lacedaemon. Lacedaemon wins the hegemony of Peloponnese, 550 to 500. Meantime the struggle between Lacedaemon and Argos continued, till before the middle of the 6th century, Sparta had wrested from her ancient rival Kinuria and Cythera. From the reign of Phidon, the Hellenes were friendly to Lacedaemon, through whose support they had conquered a broad and fertile domain. Hence they were ready for close alliance with Sparta. Corinth and Sicyon, freed from tyrannies, entered the league. Then some states of Argolis, as Trezen and Epidaurus, and afterward Megara and Aegina. Before the close of the 6th century, all the states of Peloponnese, excepting Argolis and the greater part of Achaea, were leagued with Lacedaemon. Organization of the Peloponnesian League. There was no general federal constitution, but a separate treaty united each state with Lacedaemon. The members pledged themselves to furnish military forces for the wars waged by the League, to serve under the command of the Lacedaemonian kings. No tributes were levied, but occasional contributions were required. A Congress of Deputies met at Sparta or Corinth to deliberate on federal interests, particularly on questions of war, peace, and alliance. The allies were free to manage their own affairs, and the burdens of war were light. Their representation in the common diet made them content with their position, for they felt they were free and had a fair share in the deliberations. The statement of Herodotus that the greater part of Peloponnese was subjected to Lacedaemon is therefore wholly misleading. As the union rested on a treaty basis, it was federal, though not to a degree afterward attained elsewhere. Herself under the rule of a few, and therefore hostile to both tyrannies and democracies, Lacedaemon upheld oligarchy among her allies. To this end she sometimes interfered in the home politics of her allies, and occasionally she felt compelled to check excessive ambition or self-aggrandizement in the individual states in order to maintain her own hegemony. To keep themselves qualified for a position fraught with as much burden as honor, the Spartans increased the severity of their discipline, eschewed the refinements they had formerly allowed themselves, and subjected the individual more rigorously to the state. For these purposes, increased power was given the ephors, who in the 6th century began to supersede the kings as the heads of the state. However crude and imperfect, the political system was admirable for the age. Especially it created a strong, well-centralized military force at a time when the danger of Oriental conquest began to threaten Greece. End of chapter 6.
Hellenic History by George Willis Botsford. 7. Athens, from monarchy to democracy. First, monarchy and aristocracy. Introduction. While the Lacedaemonians were creating a great military state, Athens was developing along entirely different lines. Having touched upon her civilization during the Middle Age in connection with the general condition of Hellas, we shall now follow her separate history from that period to the reforms of Cleisthenes. Unification of Attica, about 1700. In the Messenian age, Attica, as a tradition and archaeology concurrent teaching, was occupied by several independent kingdoms. The most favorable position among them was held by Athens. Its Acropolis, about 4.5 miles from the coast, formed the natural military and political center of the Cephissus basin in the heart of Attica. By conquest and negotiation, the kings who occupied this citadel gradually extended their sovereignty over the entire country. Though doubtless the work of a century or two, the unification is represented in tradition as the achievement of a single king. When Theseus came to the throne, he, a powerful and wise ruler, improved the administration of the country in other ways, and, in particular, he dissolved the councils and separate governments, and united all the inhabitants of Attica in the present city, establishing one council and town hall, Prytaneion. They continued to live on their own lands, but he compelled them to resort to Athens as their metropolis, and henceforth they were all inscribed in the roll of citizens. Among the last steps in the process were the annexation of Eleusis, about 700, and nearly a century later the acquisition of Salamis by Solon. The dynasty of the Medontide, ending in 713-712. Although the names of many kings are embedded in Attic myth, we can only be certain that the last ruling dynasty was that of the Medontide. For the government of this period we have nothing more than the survival of institutions. It is reasonable to assume as elements of the constitution a king, council of nobles, and popular assembly, like the Homeric, yet with functions more definitely fixed by the force of Minoan tradition. The king's colacrete, joint carvers, had charge of the perquisites which came to him from sacrifices, and in time this humble function developed into the office of treasurer. The king and his nobles, in heavy armor, rode to war in chariots, and for the defense of the coasts his well-to-do citizens built galleys provided with a submarine ram for attacking hostile ships. From kings for life to decennial kings, 753-752. The transition from monarchy to aristocracy was gradual, and though no ancient writer informs us, we may be sure that it was brought about by the Council of Nobles, who alone benefited by the change. It must accordingly have been this body which, about the middle of the 8th century, reduced the life tenure of the royal office to a single decade. Although the incumbent was still termed king, the monarchy in fact ceased, the supreme power passing to the council. This point, therefore, begins the period of the aristocracy. Aristocracy 753-752 to about 650. As the decennial kings proved incapable of efficient military leadership, the office of polemarch, war archon, was instituted, probably to lead the army in a conflict with Eleusis. No long time afterward, the Medontide were deposed, and the royal office was thrown open to all the nobles. Then, about 700, the office of archon was instituted. During the earlier and less known period of its history, this magistracy must have been vested with large powers, but gradually it was deprived of them, till, in the 4th century, its only civil function was the care of widows and orphans and of their estates. King, polemarch, and archon, however, in addition to the duties above mentioned, performed extensive priestly functions. Annual offices 683-682. The Thesmothete. As the decennial magistrates proved too strong and independent to serve the interests of the ruling power, all offices were made annual in 683-682, and at the same time the archon superseded the king as head of the state. In this way the government became in form as well as in fact a republic. At the same date, or shortly afterward, were instituted the 6 Thesmothetae, that they might record the customary laws and keep them from the trial of offenders. They had charge of all public documents and acted as judges in the capacity of protectors of the law. it was not till the time of Solon that the Archon, King, Polemarch, and 6 Thesmotidae were brought together in one board, that of the 9 Archons. The Council of Nobles, afterward named the Council of the Areopagus. The aristocracy was now at the summit of its power. The assembly of citizens, which had occupied only a 3rd place in the government, fell into practical desuetude. The elective power resided in the council, who called up men, and on its own judgment assigned them, according to their qualifications, to the several offices of the year. It supervised their administration and watched rigorously over the lives of the citizens, with power to punish for immoral as well as for lawless conduct. The members of this body were powerful lords, recruited annually from those who had worthily filled the 9 magistracies described above. Social classes. The Eupatrids. The privileged class were called Eupatrids, sons of noble fathers. They owned large tracts of land, equipped themselves with heavy armor, and constituted the effective military force. They had recently discarded the chariot and had adopted the custom of riding to war on horseback. Arriving on the battlefield, they dismounted to engage in combat. There were, too, a few hoplites, heavy infantry, unprovided with horses. In addition to military and administrative services, the Eupatrids filled the priesthoods, which assured them rich livings as well as a powerful instrument for governing the commons. The commons, Georgi and Demiurgi. Below the Eupatrids were the Georgi, farmers, who originally owned the lands they tilled, but who in the 7th century were mortgaging their estates and falling into slavery for debt. Still lower in the social scale were the Demiurgi, skilled workmen. Their numbers during the 7th century were but slowly increasing in Attica, which lagged behind Corinth, Aegina, and other neighbors in industry. Family and gens, genus, fratri and tribe. The unit of society was the family, which, as elsewhere in Greece, was monogamic. Whatever its rank, the family worshipped ancestral Apollo and household Zeus. The nobles formed larger associations of kinsmen, known as gentes, bound together for the worship of a reputed ancestor, for social intercourse and mutual helpfulness. The Demiurgi had their trades unions patterned after the gentes. All 3 social classes belonged promiscuously to the fratris, brotherhoods, which were groups of families assumed to be related in blood. The fratri had its annual reunion in the autumn, at the feast of the Apaturia, of the All-Fathers, evidently the spirits of the dead. On this occasion, the members worshipped the Zeus and Athena of their fratri, introduced the young children to the association, and celebrated the marriages of their members. Several fratries composed the tribe, and 4 tribes made up the state. Second, the democracy of the heavy infantry, about 650–694. The phalanx and a new territorial organization. For the overthrow of the aristocracy and the establishment of a more liberal form of government, the ground was prepared in the growing need of an improved military system. This requirement was met by the introduction of the Dorian phalanx. As the Eupatrids were too few to constitute a phalanx, they had to recruit the heavy infantry from the common landowners, whose income would enable them to equip themselves with a panoply. This undertaking was made possible for Athens by the rise of industrial cities in her neighborhood, which diminished the cost of armor. A census was introduced to determine who were to be thus liable, in order to ascertain where every man lived and what property he owned. A throughout territorial organization was necessary. The earlier organization, of which we know little, had to be adjusted to the enlarged territory. Attica was accordingly divided into 4 districts, named after the 4 tribes. Each tribal district comprised 3 smaller areas known as thirds, tritis, which were subdivided each into 4 naval townships, naukraris. The 4 census classes. Mainly with a view to military service, the people were divided into 4 classes. The Pentacosiomedimni, whose estates free from encumbrance yielded annually at least 500 Aeginetan medimni of grain, formed the highest class. We may assume that they included many eupatrids and a few commons. They held the higher offices and commands and evidently furnished for military service each 2 horses, one for himself and the other for his squire. The next lower class comprised the simple knights, hippes, who furnished each a single horse with necessary equipment, and whose obligations and privileges were generally inferior to those of the Pentacosiomedimni. This distinctive feature of the system, however, is to be found in the 3rd class, Zeugite, yoked men, members of the phalanx of heavy infantry. The 4th class comprised the poorer folk, employed only as light troops, as squires for the knights, or in the case of very poorest, totally exempt from military duty. All the classes were undoubtedly defined in terms of produce from their estates, although for this period we cannot ascertain these definitions. The phalanx, commanded by the polemarch, comprised 4 tribal regiments, each under a general. These institutions were created probably about the middle of the 7th century. The Assembly, Ecclesia, the Council of 401, and of the Aeropagus. The reform of the army bore immediate political fruit. On the principle prevailing in Hellas, that the military class determined the character of the government, the heavy infantry constituted of themselves an assembly for the election of magistrates and for the transaction of other important business. In this way, the aristocratic council lost its appointive power. In connection with the revival and reconstitution of the assembly was created a new council of 401 members, which represented the tribes and most probably the naukraris. Beyond its function of preparing bills to be offered to the assembly, we may infer that it possesses some administrative duties. Now, for the first time, it became necessary to distinguish the old aristocratic council by name. Henceforth, it was known as the Council of the Aeropagus, because it convened on that hill for the transaction of certain judicial business to be explained below. The Aeropagites, retaining large powers of supervision, were still the chief governing institution. As political privileges were graded on the basis of property, and the franchise limited to those who could furnish a panoply, we may describe the constitution as a democracy of the heavy infantry. Cylon's coup d'etat, perhaps 632 or 628. No long time after the adoption of these reforms, in a period of political and social unrest, a powerful noble named Cylon seized the Acropolis and attempted to make himself tyrant. But the heavy infantry, gathering from the country, besieged the conspirators in the citadel. When their provisions were exhausted, Cylon stole through the besieging lines. His starving followers took refuge at the great altar of Athena on the Acropolis. Hereupon the chiefs, Prytaneis, of the Naucratis, promised the suppliants their lives if they would submit to trial. They agreed. Yet, not having full confidence in the promise, they tied the thread to Athena's image, and holding one end of it, went down to the tribunal. When they came near the shrine of the Furies, the cleft at the east end of the Areopagus, the thread by which the goddess gave them her protection broke, and then the Archon, Megacles, and his supporters stoned and butchered them, permitting only a few to escape. Megacles belonged to the powerful gens of the Alcmeonidae, whom the state dared not punish for the crime. In popular beliefs, this sacrilege brought the curse of impiety upon the entire gens. Draco's codification of the criminal law, 621. It may well be that this event suggested a clearer formulation of the criminal law and a reorganization of the courts. In 621, accordingly, Draco was commissioned as thesmotete with extraordinary power to codify the criminal law, which thus far had remained an oral tradition. Homicide. The usages of ethic law, as we know it in later time, prove that in the remote past the Athenians, like the Homeric Greeks, were accustomed to the blood feud and to the acceptance of compensation for injury and homicide. There existed further in Attica, probably as a Minoan inheritance, sanctuaries to which the slayer might flee while making terms with the kinsmen of the slain. Taking advantage of this condition, Draco made use of these sanctuaries as places of trial for the various classes of homicide. Accusations were still to be brought by the near king, assisted by the feretri. But henceforth the state alone had power over the accused to punish or acquit. All prosecutions came before the king, who determined the appropriate court for the trial according to the nature of the offence. The idea, not found in Homer, that homicide brought pollution upon the door survived in Attica from the Minoan age. The trial took place, accordingly, near the sanctuary, under the open sky, that no pollution might come to the accuser from being under the same roof with the accused. Courts for the trial of homicide. Cases of wilful murder came before the old aristocratic council sitting on the Areopagus. The punishment was death, with confiscation of property. Another court was that of the Ephete, who were nobles above 50 years of age. They sat near the Palladion, a shrine of Pallas Athena, at Phaleron, for the trial of accidental homicide. The penalty in this case was temporary exile, followed by purification from the religious guilt. At the Delphinion, a shrine of Apollo and Artemis near Athens, the Ephete tried any who confessed to homicide but claimed that he did the deed in self-defense or on another justifiable ground. There was no penalty, but at least in some cases purification was required. If a man, when in exile under sentence of the Ephete, was accused of wilful murder, he was liable to trial by the same court at the Phreatto, a place on the coast. The accused was not permitted to pollute the land by his presence, but pleaded his cause in a boat moored near the shore, while the Ephete heard him from the beach. The penalty was the usual one for wilful murder. A still stranger religious idea is illustrated by the court consisting of king and tribe kings, sitting at the Prytaneion, town hall within the city. Here were tried cases in which the door was unknown. Also the killing of a person by a falling object. If convicted, the object that wrought the deed was solemnly carried, as a noxious thing, beyond the border of the country. Character of the draconian laws. In the definite provision for mitigating circumstances in homicide, and in the total suppression of the blood feud and compensations by the establishment of courts with full competence to try and punish offenders, Draco contributed vastly to the benevolence of law and to domestic security and peace. The Athenians of after time looked back to him with great reverence and thought of his ordinances as the product of a wisdom higher than that of a man. Whoever made them originally, whether heroes or gods, did not oppress the unfortunate, but humanly alleviated their miseries, so far as they could with right. His reputation suffered but slightly by the discovery, in the 4th century, of his law of theft, then long obsolete, which fixed the penalty of death for stealing a cabbage or an apple. The people were starving, and in keeping with the severity of the times, this penalty had been retained in the code in the interest of the landowners. Trial of the Alcmeonide. After the adoption of these measures, the faction of Cylon, recovering strength, brought the Alcmeonide to trial for sacrilege before a court of 300 nobles. Although the actual perpetrators of the crime were dead, a verdict of guilty was found. In punishment, the remains of the dead were cast beyond the border, and the gens was condemned to perpetual exile. As the whole city seemed polluted by the rank impiety, Epimenides, a Cretan, was called in to purify the community. Third, the reforms of Solon, 594. Oppression and revolt of the commons. Solon. In an earlier chapter, we touched on the economic decline of the Attic peasantry, and noticed the fact that most of their farms were mortgaged to the rich, and that many freemen were in slavery for debt. Draco's reforms did not touch the economic condition, which daily became more insupportable, or check the magistrates in their career of embezzlement, plunder, and judicial oppression. The newly constituted assembly and the phalanx, however, served as the nucleus of a popular organization. In the spirit of freemen, the masses revolted against their oppressors. Civil war broke out, and the blood of citizens was spilled. At this crisis, Solon came forward as a mediator. He was a man of the highest nobility, though of moderate fortune, a merchant, a poet, and sage. Under his military leadership and inspired by his martial verse, the Athenians had wrested Salamis from the Megarians. Thus he had won a reputation which strengthened his appeal to the two parties to lay aside their differences. They joined in electing him archon and legislator, Thesmotete, for 594, with absolute power. Abolition of securities. On entering office, Solon proclaimed an abolition of all securities on land and person. Of this work he himself says, "In the just fullness of time, the mighty mother of the Olympian gods, even black earth most excellent, will bear me witness that I removed the mortgage pillars which stood in many places, she who was formerly in slavery, but now set free. To Athens, our country divinely founded, I restored many men who had been sold, one illegally, another under the law. Some, whom hard necessity had forced into exile, who in their many wanderings had forgot the Attic tongue. Others, held here in unseemly slavery, and trembling under their masters' caprices, I set free. This I did by my power, uniting force with justice. The future safety of the commons. To secure the liberty of the commons for the future, he prohibited the mortgaging of persons. For curbing the avarice of the rich, he limited by law the amount of land which the individual might acquire. As the large landowners were shipping their grain to the thriving industrial centers in the neighborhood of Attica, thus reducing the masses to starvation, Solon forbade the exportation of all products of the soil, except olive oil, of which there was a surplus. More stimulating were his laws for the encouragement of industry. He attached a heavy fine to idleness and compelled every man to teach his son a trade. As there were too few artisans to serve as models for the rest and make a beginning of industry, he offered the citizenship to skilled workmen of other countries on the condition of their settling permanently in Attica. In the same liberal spirit, citizens were permitted to marry non-Athenians women, and the children of such unions had full social and political rights. Another law, afterward adopted by the Romans, encouraged the formation of corporations for the transactions of various kinds of business. Coinage. A further impetus was given to commerce by the adoption of a native coinage. The Euboic standard was chosen for the purpose, undoubtedly to facilitate trade with the Colchis and Eretria and their many colonies. Family law. In his reform of family law, Solon aimed to free the individual from kin and gens, with the object of attaching him more closely to the state. His enactment that anyone who wished might go to law in defense of an injured person tended to substitute neighborly friendliness and governmental protection in place of the old tie of blood. Heretofore, wills were unknown, and in lack of children, the estate passed to the nearest of kin. Solon, however, enacted that in case a man had no children, he might will his estate to whomsoever he pleased. This law freed property from the control of the kin, and granted the individual more complete possession of his own. These regulations gave a freer scope to the individuality of the citizens, and placed them in a better position to serve the state. Criminal law. In his revision of the criminal code of Draco, he lightened the excessive penalties, but left the laws of homicide substantially untouched. Recognizing the harshness of previous judicial decisions, he decreed an amnesty to all who were in exile excepting those condemned for homicide or attempted tyranny. Under this edict, the Alcmeonidae returned to their homes. The four census classes and magistrates. Among his first constitutional measures was a revision of the definitions of the four census classes. For the medimnus, he substituted the lighter matron, wet and dry measure, so as to include in the reckoning oil and wine as well as grain. A pentacosio medimnus was accordingly one who produced 500 measures, wet and dry, from his estate. A hippeus 300 to 500, et zeugite 200 to 300, a thete less than 200. Through this reform, many must have been advanced from lower to higher ratings. The treasurers were to be drawn exclusively from the highest class, the archons from the first and second, the zeugites were eligible to the council of 400, and the thetes, disbarred from all individual offices and boards, were now admitted to the assembly, ecclesia. Council of 400, Assembly and Supreme Court. The Council of 401, dropping the odd number, seems to have remained in other respects the same. The assembly was made more democratic by the admission of the thetes. Solon instituted the Supreme Court, the Eliea, to which men above 30 years from all four census classes were eligible. Its function was to receive appeals from the judicial decisions of the archons and to try the retiring magistrates for misconduct in office in case anyone accused them. Constitutional balance. The widening of the franchise to include the Tethys and the establishment of the Elea made the government more popular. In the absence of pay for public service, however, the citizens could rarely attend the assembly in large numbers, and few could sit in the Elea. These bodies were therefore practically controlled by the well-to-do. The high property qualifications of the magistrates and the supervisory power of the Areopagites, left unimpaired by Solon, were strong aristocratic elements. We have from himself an estimate of his constitutional reform. I gave the commons as much power as sufficed, neither detracting from their honor nor adding thereto. Those who possessed might and were illustrious in wealth, for them I planned that they should suffer not unseemly. In other place he says, thus the commons would best follow their leaders, neither given too much rein, nor yet oppressed. The rich and noble were to fill the offices, the commons were to have only enough power to check them and preserve their own liberty. Fourth, the tyranny, 560-510. Factional strife, 593-560. Few were satisfied with Solon's reforms. The shoremen, containing many fishermen and traders, were inclined to abide by his arrangements. But men of the plain, eupatrids with large estates, were irritated by his concessions to the poor, whereas the inhabitants of the hills, including the turbulent shepherds, were disappointed in their expectation of a redistribution of property. These factions, firstly, contended with one another. Peisistratus. In time, the leadership of the hills fell to Peisistratus, a distant relative of Solon. Smooth of speech, courteous in bearing, and master of political trickery, he enjoyed too a brilliant military reputation gained in a war with Megara, about 570-565. In the belief that his political adversaries sought his life, the assembly voted him a personal guard, with which he seized the Acropolis in 560 and made himself tyrant. Twice a combination of the two rival factions caused his retirement into exile, but finally gaining complete supremacy, he maintained it with the aid of mercenaries. His tyranny, 560-510. Peisistratus is an excellent type of the statesman-despot. His hand lay heavily on the nobles alone. Those of the class who were too independent of spirit or too ambitious to submit were forced into exile. There are indications that he confiscated the estates of such persons and divided them in small farms among the poor. To the needy country people he gave seeds and work animals for stocking their farms. The number of cultivators he greatly increased by such encouragements and by the expulsion of idlers from the city. Thus, supplementing Solon's emancipation of debtor slaves, Peisistratus founded a numerous, thriving agricultural class, which remained prosperous long after his family has ceased to rule. His tax of 1/10, afterward reduced to 1/20, on the produce was burdensome only to the most sterile farms. Seeing on the slope of Hymettus a certain man digging and working among the rocks with a stake, he bade his servant ask what was produced in the place. The other replied, "Only ashes and pains, and of these ashes and pains Pisistratus must have his tenth. The man answered without knowing him, but Pisistratus, pleased with his candour and his love of work, made him exempt from all taxes. Commerce, exports. From all that we can learn, his policy must have been rural rather than industrial. A wide exportation of wine, olive oil, and toilet ointments is proved by the great number of Attic vases of this period, found in various parts of the ancient world, from Etruria to Egypt, Asia Minor, and the shores of the Black Sea. They are of the black figure type, characterized by paintings in black glaze on a red background, produced during the rule of Pisistratus. Shortly after the accession of Hippias, this class gave way to the more highly developed red figure style, which too was widely diffused by trade. Potters' shops, accordingly, were increasing in size and in the number of hands employed. Relations with other states. Commerce must in fact have derived great encouragement from the treaty relations which Pisistratus established with many states, from Thessaly to Lacedaemon, and the peace thus guaranteed was an additional basis of prosperity. The colonies of Sigeum on the Hellespont he founded, or at least reinforced it, and appointed a son to govern it. Under the tyrant's patronage, Miltiades, an eminent Eupatrid, conducted a colony to the Chersonese on the European side of the Hellespont. Both settlements remained dependencies of Athens. In brief, it is not too much to regard Pisistratus as the creator of Athenian diplomacy and of a place of dignity and influence for his city among the states of Hellas. Enforcement of Solon's laws. At home, he enforced the existing laws and constitution, taking care only to secure by his control of the political machinery the election of kinsmen or partisans to the chief offices. The masses were attached to him by his benefits to them, and many of the nobles by the social attractions of his court. Hippias, 527-510, and Hipparchus. When Pisistratus died of old age in 527, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus continued his policy. The former, as the elder and as a man of statesmanlike character, managed political affairs, while the more cultured brother attended to the erection of public works and acted as patron of literature and art. Public works. The most useful public works of the Pisistratide, as the dynasty is termed, were a subterranean aqueduct, which brought a supply of fresh water to the city from the upper valley of the Ilissus, and a system of roads which radiated through Attica from the altar of the 12 gods in the marketplace. Their extensive building of temples, their enlargement of religious festivals by the addition of new features, the patronage of artists and poets, with the general effect of advancing the social happiness, the taste, the intelligence of the citizens, will be touched upon in the following chapter. Archer tyranny, 514-510. An epoch was made in the character of the tyranny by the assassination of Hipparchus in 514. The perpetrators of the deed were two young nobles, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, whose motive in stirring up a conspiracy against the tyrants was an insult offered them by Hipparchus in an affair of love. The plot failed. Hippias escaped, and the assassins with several accomplices were put to death. Throughout Athenian history, the murderers of Hipparchus were celebrated in song as tyrannicides, and their descendants were decreed special privileges forever. Far from overthrowing the tyranny, however, their conspiracy served to change good to bad. Hippias now became suspicious and harsh, a tyrant in the unfavorable sense of the word. The downfall of tyranny, 510. To the emigrant nobles, these conditions offered a favorable opportunity to attempt a return. Their leaders were the Alcmeonidae, who had won the favor of the Delphic Apollo by their magnificent rebuilding of his temple after its destruction by fire. By means of the oracle, accordingly, they were able to win the Lacedaemonians to their aid. Whenever the authorities at Sparta sent to consult it, the answer always was, Athens must be set free. At this time, the Peloponnesian League reached the borders of Attica, and the command of Apollo was strengthened by Lacedaemonian ambition. With the force of Peloponnesians, King Cleomenes of Sparta joined the Alcmeonidae and their faction in besieging Hippias in the Acropolis. The children of the besieged were taken in an attempt to steal through the lines. To save them, Hippias surrendered on condition of returning from the country. In this way, the tyranny came to an end in 510. Fifth, the establishment of democracy, 508-501. A factional oligarchy, 510-509. The downfall of Hippias was a victory for the emigrant nobles, who, on their return, began to rule in lordly style. Revising the citizen lists, they struck off the names of a multitude whose ancestors had been enrolled by Solon and Pisistratus. Their object was not only to secure political control, but to recover their confiscated estates. Opposition to Cleisthenes, as head of the nobles and their adherents, was made by Isagoras, a friend of Hippias. The struggle between the two men for supremacy was carried on in the political clubs without the cooperation of the people. The election of Isagoras to the archonship for 508 proved his superior strength. Thereupon Cleisthenes, unwilling to submit to such constitutional forms as then existed, appealed to the disfranchised masses, promising them a restoration of their political rights, on condition of their helping him oust Isagoras from office. The people responded, and in spite of the interference of Cleomenes, they ultimately triumphed. Isagoras was forced to exile, and Cleisthenes was given full power, probably as Thesmothethe, to fulfill his promise. The thoroughness with which he accomplished his task proved him a statesman, and notwithstanding his earlier oligarchic tendencies, in the depth of his heart a lover of democratic freedom. The demes. The growth of the rural population under the tyranny, with the great increase in the number of villages, rendered the 48 naucraries inadequate as a local organization. Cleisthenes, accordingly, began his reforms with the division of all Attica into more than 100 demes, townships, differing greatly in extent and population and centering, as a rule, in existing villages. All who resided in a deme at the time of its institution were enrolled as members, hence as Athenian citizens. This provision included not only the recently disfranchised, but also many alien residents and emancipated slaves. The franchise was thus more widely extended than ever before. The families so enrolled remained members of the original deme, irrespective of residence. The deme had a complete local organization, including demarch, major, treasurer, priests and priestess, attending to the service of the local gods, common property and revenue, and an assembly of members, whose resolutions were binding on the townsmen in so far as they did not conflict with the laws of the state. In the township, the citizens received a training in politics and administration, which helped fit them for their part in the larger government of the state. It was, in fact, the nursery of the democracy. The treaties. The demes were grouped in 30 treaties, in such a way as to make the latter approximately equal in population. In one or two cases, a treatise contained a single large deme, but generally a greater varying number. Each treatise, therefore, was a definite district. It had no communal life, but served merely as a connecting link between the township and the tribe. In the creation of these districts, Cleisthenes provided further that 10 should lie near the shore, 10 in the hills, 10 in the plain. The tribes, phyle. Of the treatise he composed 10 tribes, phyle, drawing by lot for each tribe a treatise from the shore, plain, and hills, respectively. The result was that in the map of Attica, which we can reconstruct only for a later time, some tribes were made up of treaties which did not touch one another, whereas other tribes formed continuous, though irregular, districts. There were local changes after Cleisthenes, however, and it may well be that he consistently separated the treaties of a tribe. One object of the peculiar arrangement of townships was, by distributing the local factions among all the tribes, to break up their sectional organizations and put to an end their mutual antipathies. By the same arrangement, too, Cleisthenes succeeded in making the tribes approximately equal, not only in population, but in economy, to the end that the burdens of military service and taxation might be distributed evenly among them. Another object of far-reaching importance was to make the tribes politically equal. Had some of them been wholly near Athens and others wholly remote, the nearer tribes would have controlled the rest, but the location of some demes of every tribe, in Athens or its vicinity, secured an approximately equal representation of all the tribes in the assembly. Largely on this condition rested the success of the democracy. Each tribe had its board of supervisors, its worship of the eponymous hero, treasurer, and communal property, assembly of members, and other institutions. Each performed its share of the unpaid public services, such as the building and repair of fortifications or the equipment and training of lyric choruses. The 4 old tribes were abolished. The naucraries, superseded by the demes, lingered on a few years. Although the gentes of the nobles remained, their influence was greatly curtailed. The old citizens retained their phratries, and new phratries seem to have been instituted for those who were newly admitted. The central government. The Council of 500. The organization of the central government was adjusted to the new tribes. The Council of 400 was increased to 500, 50 from each tribe, distributed among the demes in proportion to their population. For official purposes, Cleisthenes divided the year into 10 equal periods, corresponding to these 10 tribal delegations, and enacted that the delegations should take their turns each for a tenth of the year, in managing the current business of the council. The 50 members on duty were termed Prytanes, foremen, and their period was called a Prytany. The Prytanes, while dispatching routine business on their own responsibility, reported the more serious matters for the consideration of the entire 500. Of the business thus laid before it, the council disposed finally of the lighter affairs, and incorporated those of greater weight in bills for presentation to the assembly. Henceforth, too, in the supervision of administrative officers, it undoubtedly gained ground at the expense of the Areopagites. The Council of the Areopagus. The Council of the Areopagus, now containing many friends of Hippias, could no longer be trusted as the sole guardian of the constitution. One who persecuted a citizen for treason or political conspiracy still had the privilege of bringing the accusation before that body, or he might, under a new statute, bring the accused before the popular assembly. While the authority of the Areopagites remained legally untouched in all other respects, it was in fact necessarily lessened by the increasing vitality of the 500 and of the assembly. The assembly and the Heliea, the magistrates. The membership of the assembly was greatly enlarged by the extension of the franchise, and its citizens were encouraged by the reform to take a more active interest in public affairs. The popular court, Heliea, seems to have remained unchanged. The archons were still the chief magistrates, and the generals, who commanded the tribal regiments under the polemarch, were increased to 10. In addition to the small funds belonging to the several shrines of Attica, there were 2 chief public treasuries, that of Athena, under the treasurers Tamie, of the goddess, and the Demosion, state treasury, under the Colacrete. Cleisthenes instituted a board of 10 receivers, apodecte, who, under the supervision of the 500, received all incoming monies and assigned them to the appropriate treasuries. It was a step towards the unification of public finances. Ostracism. Cleisthenes introduced a peculiar institution termed ostracism. The word is derived from ostrakon, piece of pottery, which was the form of ballot used in the process. Once a year, if the assembly so resolved, the citizens met and voted against any of their number whom they judged dangerous to the state. After the ballots were cast, the archons counted the whole number of ostraca, for if the entire number of voters was less than 6,000, the ostracism was without effect. Next, they counted the number of times each name occurred, and that man against whom most votes were recorded was sent into exile for 10 years. In other words, a quorum of 6,000 was necessary to secure the validity of the act, and in case of such a quorum, a plurality of votes decided the question as to the person to be banished. Such an exile, though inconvenient, was considered an honor. For understanding the purpose and effect of ostracism, it is important to notice that from of old Athens had been afflicted with factional strife, renewed after the fall of the tyranny. These struggles sometimes took the form of civil war, which ended in the banishment or the massacre of the weaker party. Through ostracism, Cleisthenes replaced civil war by voting in the settlement of factional strife and required the banishment of the leader of the weaker faction, rather than the sacrifice of his entire following. That a man who had committed no crime should be sent into exile was indeed unjust, and yet it was far juster and more humane than the banishment or massacre of an entire political party merely because it chanced to be the weaker. Marketplace, pnyx, and governmental buildings. The extraordinary meetings of the ecclesia for the voting of ostracism were held in the marketplace, where doubtless the people had gathered in assembly even under the kings. Henceforth, however, other sessions of the whole people were usually held on the pnyx, a hill nearly west of the Acropolis. But in most respects the marketplace remained the seat of political life. On its border, the party of Cleisthenes erected a council chamber for the 500, a rotunda for the Prytaneis, a king's porch, and other governmental buildings. In this way, the new democracy began to stamp its character upon the architecture of the city. The reorganization completed 501. The surveying of the demes, whose boundaries were marked by stones, and the completion of the intricate local arrangements on which the entire constitution rested, was the work of several years. We are not surprised, therefore, to learn that the institution of the new council and the reorganization of the army under the 10 generals were completed as late as 501. The constitutional balance. Regarding the constitutional reforms as a whole, we may say with Grote that they preserved, but at the same time modified and strengthened, all the main features of Solon's political measures. It was a democracy, though held in check by strong conservative balances. As democratic elements may especially be mentioned the lessening of the Eupatrids and tyrannist influence, the broadening of the civic franchise, and the energizing of the political and patriotic spirit in the demes, and thence, in the 500, assembly and Heliea, a spirit soon to manifest itself in prodigious military, artistic, and intellectual activities. The most prominent conservative or aristocratic checks were the prevalence of country life, which prevented the majority from taking the part in public affairs granted them by the Constitution, the absence of pay for public service, which debarred the poor from continuous participation in offices, and, in both assembly and courts, the high property qualifications for magistrates, and the great powers of the Council of Areopagus, now modestly holding itself in the political background, but soon to regain gradually its supervision of government and people. Though we may speak of Cleisthenes as the founder of democracy, the government was far less democratic than it became in the following century. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8. Intellectual Awakening, 750 to 479. Part 1. Social and Literary Progress. Correlation of Activities, 750 to 479. The Alphabet and Writing. It was due in part to increasing intelligence that about the middle of the 8th century the Greeks entered upon an era of industrial development, colonial expansion, and political progress. These movements, on the other hand, interacting upon one another, afforded so powerful a stimulus to the mind that we may describe the period thus beginning as one of intellectual awakening. The means of accumulating knowledge essential to great progress was the employment of the alphabet for the preservation of literature. While adopting the Phoenician alphabet, the Ionians modified it to fit the peculiarities of their language. As its use extended over Greece, it differentiated according to dialect into various systems. For a long time, however, it seems to have been restricted to the writing of names on lots and perhaps mercantile accounts. Thence it extended to inscriptions on gifts dedicated to the gods, lists of priests who officiated in succession at temples, and of magistrates after a limit had been placed on the tenure of office. The earliest documents involving connected discourse were laudatory epitaphs, treaties between states, and laws. Probably the Homeric hymns were long preserved orally. We cannot be sure of a written literature before the 7th century. The Rhapsodists. The Iliad and the Odyssey, as stated in an earlier chapter, were mainly Iolic, dominated by Indo-European ideas. Not long after their composition, the Homeridae, sons of Homer, Aegeans of Chios, were journeying through Ionia and the rest of Hellas, chanting them at the courts of the great and in popular gatherings. From the staff, rhabdos, which these singers waved in marking time, they came to be known as rhapsodists. Many were the minstrels, however, who made no claim to descent from their poet. The cycle, about 750 to 600. Under the Homeric inspiration, Ionic poets of the 8th and 7th centuries composed various epics, forming a group known as the cycle. These poems are lost. We know them through scant fragments still preserved, and through their extensive use by Attic dramatists of later time. From these sources, we learn that the Ionians of the period, unlike the Homeric Greeks, were essentially Minoan. They practiced magic, believed in ghosts, worshipped the dead, and had traditions of human sacrifices. They believed, further, in religious pollution incurred by homicide and in the power of cleansing such guilt by ceremonies of purification, especially with the use of swine's blood. In dress and armor also, they were heirs of the decadent Minoan civilization. An intense life of increasing complexity, 750 to 479. Life in Ionia during this period, however, was anything but stagnant. The change from rural to industrial economy, the growth of cities and of a leisurely class, as well as contact with the entire Mediterranean world afforded by colonization and commerce, brought this country distinctly to the foreground of Hellenic civilization. The abolition of kingship and the rise of aristocracies and tyrannies involving these factional struggles added to the intensity of life. To express these complex conditions, the old epic verse of calm, stately meter, the dactylic hexameter, proved wholly inadequate. It gave way accordingly to new and varied measures, which would better exhibit the play of individual or communal thought and emotion characteristic of the new era. The Elegy, Calenus, about 650. The first variation from the epic verse is found in the elegiac pentameter, whose spirit may be either meditative or emotional. Accompanied by the pipe, it lent itself equally to the expression of political and social thought, religious devotion, and martial fire. The first great master of the elegy was Calenus of Ephesus. About the middle of the 7th century, when the savage Cimmerians from north of the Black Sea were ravaging the Ephesian territory, he roused his countrymen to battle with the following song. Sit ye in quiet how long? Stir up the fierce spirit within you. Have ye no feeling of shame, youths, for the dwellers around? Why thus remiss? Do ye think ye are sitting in blissful contentment, peace given, while dread war holds all our dear native land? Now in the moment of death, hurl your last spear at the foe. Honored is he and esteemed who fights in the foremost of lancers, guarding his country, his home, guarding his dear wedded wife. Fighting with foes, for death comes but once, and whenever it may be, fate cuts the thread of our life. Each must go quick to the front, grasping his spear in his hand, and under his shield his untrembling heart pressing, panting for fight, mingling in deadliest fray. Fate hath decreed that from death there shall be by no prudence escaping. Doomed are all mortals to die, saving no sons of the gods. Often the din of the battle, the hurtling of lancers surviving, sees man the terror of death stalking into his home. Weaklings are dear to no state, nor in death by the people lamented. Warriors the great and the small mourn when they face their fair doom. Longing intense fills all hearts in the land for the stout-minded hero. Dying in liberty's cause, living they hold him divine, just like a tower of defense in the eyes of the people appearing. Works he the deeds of a host, striving alone in his might. Tyrtaeus of Lacedaemon. In its patriotic ideal and martial spirit, this poem is akin to the elegy of Tyrtaeus already cited. In fact, the latter poet must be regarded as a pupil of the Ionians. Along with the elegy, Tyrtaeus used other forms of verse, as did also Solon of Athens, who lived but shortly afterward. Archilochus. A greater personal intensity distinguishes the poetry of Archilochus, the first Greek, hence the first European, of whose private character we are in a position, through the fragments of his verse, to obtain clear, though fleeting, glimpses. In addition to composing elegies, he was the first great master of the iambic, a measure adapted to energetic expression, giving utterance to the whole range of human passions, from love to sarcasm and hate. His stormy life was typical of the age and of his social class. The son of an aristocratic father and slave mother, in youth he was forced by poverty and want to leave his native Paros and join a colony his countrymen had established in Thasos. But he had no love for this new home, this woeful island that stands with wild wood, bristling like a donkey's back, no fair land, or lovely, or dear. With his fellow colonists, he probably exploited the gold mines of the island, and certainly he fought with them against the Thracians on the neighboring mainland. Having thrown away his shield and fled in this battle, a most disgraceful act, he afterward boasted of it. Vaunts some Thracian wight of the beautiful shield I abandoned, all uninjured by scars, grudgingly left by the brook. Body and soul I have rescued. What matter? The peace may go begging. Soon a new buckler I'll find, better by far than the old. A soldier of fortune. He could not remain long in Thasos, because, as he admitted, he was too insolent, abusing friend and foe alike, and doubtless prudence forbade his return to Paros. Hence he became a wanderer over sea and land, a poet-soldier of fortune, as he tells us. I am a companion of the Lord of War, and I know the lovely gift of the Muses. More drastically he writes, Bread for me baked is the gain of my spear. In my spear is the vintage Ismarus yields to my call. Lean I on lance while I drink. He seems a pirate from these words. There were 7 dead men trampled underfoot, and we were 1,000 murderers. These quotations are from his elegies. In an iambic poem he teaches a lesson in moderation. The gold of rich King Gyges stirs in me no hate. No slave of envy am I. I do not emulate the wondrous deeds of gods, nor love the tyrant's might. Such things unworthy lie beyond mine eyes' dear sight. A tempestuous spirit. In love as in hate, he reveals the same tempestuous spirit. Jilted by Niobe, so reads the tale, he lost no time in sad lament, but with his biting iambics drove her and her sister to hang themselves. This man of muscle and redundant mental power, enjoying in a restless mercenary career the pleasures that came his way, giving deadly presents to his foes, or inspiring distressed friends with hopeful courage, wrote verses that placed him second to Homer, establishing him as the unequaled artist of personal song. Aeolian culture, Alcaeus, about 600 to 550. Passing on from the 7th to the 6th century, we return from Ionian lands to the home of the Aeolians, who created the Homeric poems, and who, in Lesbos, kept cultural pace with their southern neighbors. Mytilene, the chief Lesbic city, trading with Egypt, enjoyed the imported refinements of the Orient. Less devoted than the Ionians, however, to commercial and the useful arts, the race gave itself wholeheartedly to social enjoyment, to the lyre and song. Lesbos, the center of Aeolian culture, was the island of overmastering passions. The personality of the Greek race burned there with a fierce and steady flame of concentrated feeling. Here the poems of Alcaeus, mere shreds as they now are, lead us into the midst of civil strife. The monarchy had yielded to aristocratic factions, through whose struggles for supremacy scheming leaders of the populace made their way to tyranny. Nor was the poet himself clear from the imputation of seeking supreme power. Against his adversary Marcellus he thus declaims, This man, this raving idiot here, with rank supreme and power great, will quickly overthrow the state. Already is the crisis near. The poet's first exile. Zeus is angry at the motherland. The usurpation of the tyranny by Marcellus and the failure of a conspiracy to dislodge him drove the poet into exile at Pyrrha, a small but independent town in the island. There he apostrophizes his sorrowing fatherland. What purpose or intent is in thee, my country, that thou hast been so long time distraught? Be of good cheer, for the son of Cronos himself did tell thee that thou hadst no need to fear warfare, howsoever it should seize thee, nor should neighbor foeman, nay nor oarsman from over the far-bounded sea, maintain for long the woeful conflict of the far-flung spear, unless thou shouldst of thyself send afar all the best of thy people, to sunder them from thee, for 'tis men that are a city's tower in war. But alas, thou no longer doest the Father's will, and a swift fate hath overtaken thee. Now I make this prayer for thee, that I may no longer see the daylight, if the son of Cleonax, or yonder Splitfoot, or the son of Archeonax, be suffered more to live, by one whom his dear sweet native land, and factious strife as old as itself, together have done away. Soon the death of the tyrant, probably by violence, permitted the return of the poet's faction. Pittacus, dictator, Aesymnetes. Some time afterward, the establishment of a popular government at Mytilene again forced Alcaeus and his friends into exile. To guard against their armed return, the Lesbians appointed their ablest man, Pittacus, dictator. Of him the people sang as they ground their barley, "Grind, mill, grind, for Pittacus himself is grinding, ruling mighty Mytilene." Pittacus himself employed monarchical power to dissolve the despotism of the many, but having accomplished his task, he restored the independence of the city. His generous amnesty recalled the nobles from banishment, and Alcaeus passed the remainder of his days in peace. During the long period of seditions, the poet had encouraged his friends by songs of party strife, from which quotations have been made above. A wide range of interests. In addition to martial and political themes, he wrote on a great variety of subjects, including travel, nature, love, drinking, and other topics. His poems were personal lyrics sung among friends to the accompaniment of the lyre. His favorite stanza, named Alcaic after him and probably his invention, is fairly represented in the following translation of a convivial song for a wintry evening. Zeus hails, the streams are frozen, in the sky a mighty storm is raging high. And now the forest thick, the ocean hoar, grow clamorous with the Thracian tempest's roar. But drive away the storm, and make the fire hotter, and pile the logs and faggots higher, pour out the tawny wine with lavish hand, and bind about thy head a fleecy band. It ill befits to yield the heart to pain. What profits grief, or what will sorrow gain? O Bacchus, bring us wine, delicious wine, and sweet exhilaration, balm divine. The taste of after ages preferably cited his drinking songs, with the result that they abound among his extant fragments. We are glad to learn, therefore, from a Latin critic that he contributed greatly to the improvement of morals. With much of the genius, versatility, and fire of Archilochus, the Lesbic poet possessed a more amiable disposition. Both open to us an invaluable insight into the life and character of their times, and both exerted a determining influence on the literature of after ages. Women in society and in literature, 7th and 6th centuries. In these times the domain of literature was not monopolized by men. In fact, the social and intellectual development of women during the 7th and 6th centuries has a unique place in the history of the world. It is true that under Oriental influence the upper-class Ionians segregated their women. Among them, wives never ate with their husbands or called them by name. Hesiod, the crabbed, parsimonious, Boeotian farmer, who regards woman as a beast of burden, quotes a myth which attributes the origin of all sin and suffering to a fair, deceitful girl. Straightway did the glorious lame one fashion the likeness of a modest maiden, as the son of Cronos willed. And the goddess grey-eyed Athena girdled and arrayed her, the goddess Graces and Lady Persuasion hung chains of gold about her, the fair-tressed Hours crowned her with flowers of spring. All manner of adornment did Pallas Athena bestow about her person, and in her breast the messenger, the slayer of Argos, put lies and cunning words in her deceitful soul, as Zeus the thunderer willed. Also the messenger of the gods gave her speech, and he named this woman Pandora, for that all the dwellers in Olympus had bestowed on her a gift, to be the bane of men that live by bread. It was she who opened the jar containing 10,000 evils, which forthwith flew out among men to distress them forever. Contempt for women. Such beliefs tended to degrade women in society. A tone of utter contempt pervades the poem of Simonides of Amorgus, which compares various types of women to different animals. The tattler is like a dog, who goes about retailing news. Nor can her husband make her stop even with threats, though in a rage he should knock out her teeth with a stone, nor though he speak to her gently, even when she is sitting in company with guests. The dainty and extravagant woman resembles a horse, who will do no mean or servile work. She will not touch the hand-mill or sieve, or sweep the house, or sit by the fire, for fear of soot. She bathes carefully twice a day or thrice, and anoints herself with toilet oils. Always she wears her tresses combed and with blossoms shaded. A comely thing is such a wife for others to behold, but an evil to him who weds her, unless he be a tyrant or a king, who with such things adorns his fancy. All, however, were constrained to praise the ideal wife and mother. In the poem of Simonides she is like a bee. Fortunate he who wins her hand, for she alone to censure gives no cause, but in her life doth bloom and doth increase. Dear to her loving spouse she groweth old. The mother she of children fair and famed, distinguished she among good women all, a grace divine doth play about her form. General freedom of women, their luxuries, and their education. Generally outside of Ionia, women went about freely in the streets, on foot or in carriages, and mingled with men in social life. Those of the wealthy class dyed their hair, painted their faces, and wore luxurious jewelry and dresses. The Doric peplos, a woolen garment fastened at the shoulders with large, deadly pins, was relatively simple. At first it was worn on all the Greek mainland, but at some time in our period the Athenian women changed to the Ionic chiton of linen, either sewn or fastened with small pins down the arm. The new style of dress admitted of great elaboration. Over the chiton of either form the lady threw a mantle, epiblemma, himation, on going out. By combinations of bright colors, by costly embroideries and sparkling jewelry, the wealthy lady produced a brilliant effect. At the same time, the custom of large dowries had arisen, with the result that marriage was coming to be regarded as a business transaction. Early legislators attempted to check the luxury and the personal liberty of women, and Solon, in addition, restricted the dowry to 3 hymatia and a few cheap articles of household furniture. Notwithstanding his efforts, the high-born women of his country suffered but little restriction during the next century and a half, while throughout Hellas those of the middle and lower classes remained as free as ever. The liberty and power of the Laconian women have been sufficiently considered. In Boeotia, Argos, Sicyon, and Lesbos there were women who received a remarkable education, as is evidenced by the poetesses of these localities. The 6th century, along with the early 5th, was in fact the most brilliant period, at least till recent times, in the intellectual history of women. Sappho and her friends, early 6th century. Sappho herself belonged to an aristocratic family which stood high in the politics and society of Lesbos. She was influential enough to suffer banishment with her relatives for political causes, and in time appreciation of her genius grew till her native country honored her by stamping her image on its coins. In a society which could not separate loveliness of form from perfection of character, she became the center of a literary circle, only in this sense a school of beautiful, brilliant girls. They, too, were composers of music and song. In this circle it was a disgrace to be illiterate. She who writes not, declares Sappho, will go down ignobly in Hades' realm. Yea, thou shalt die, and lie, dumb in the silent tomb, nor of thy name shall there be any fame, in ages yet to be, or years to come. For of the flowering rose that on Pieria blows, thou hast no share, but in sad Hades' house, unknown, inglorious, mid the dim shades that wander there, shalt thou flit forth and haunt the filmy air. Relations between Sappho and her girlfriends. Undoubtedly, the circle represents an effort of highly gifted women to rise above the humdrum existence, alike of drudgery and fashion, to the nobler life of the mind and heart. Between Sappho and her girlfriends there was the warmest attachment. The following poem has reference to a pupil who deserted her for another instructor. So my Atthis has not come back, and in sooth I wish I were dead. Yet she wept full sore to leave me behind, and said, Alas, how sad our lot, Sappho! I swear 'tis all against my will I leave thee. To her I answered, Go thy way, rejoicing, and remember me, for thou knowest how fond I was of thee. If thou rememberest not, I am fain to remind thee how dear and beautiful was the life we led together. For with many a garland of violets and sweet roses mingled, hast thou decked thy flowing locks by my side, and with many a woven necklet, made of 100 blossoms, thy dainty throat. And with many a jar of myrrh, of the precious and royal kinds, hast thou anointed thy fair young face before me, and reclining upon the couch, hast thou satisfied thyself with dainty meats and sweet drinks. Nausicaa, who now lives in Sardis. Here as elsewhere, she glorifies the beauty of form and the pleasures of sense. Another poem, addressed to a girl still with her, was doubtless to be sent to a former pupil, Nausicaa, now living in Sardis, most probably the wife of a Lydian grandee. At this, our beloved Nausicaa dwells in far-off Sardis, but she often sends her thoughts hither, recalling how once we used to live in the days when she thought thee like a glorious goddess, and loved thy song the best. Now she shines among the dames of Lydia, as after sunset the rosy-fingered moon beside the stars that are about her, when she spreads her light o'er briny sea, and eke o'er flowery field, while the good dew lies on the ground, and the dainty anthrisk, and the honey lotus with all its blooms. And oftentimes, when our beloved, wandering abroad, calls to mind her gentle Atthis, the heart devours her tender breast with pain of longing, and she cries aloud for us to come hither. And what she says we know full well, thou and I, for night, the many-eared, calls it to us across the dividing sea. Summary of Sappho's interests. Here are interesting glimpses of woman's literary life, of social relations between Lesbos and Lydia, of telepathic sympathy added to a delicate appreciation of natural beauty in the night, the sea, and flowers. Often elsewhere are sympathetic touches of nature, as when she speaks of spring's messenger, the deep-voiced nightingale, or refers to the spot where, all around through branches of apple orchards, cool streams call, while adown from the leaves a-tremble, slumber distilleth. With all of her love of flowery fields, cool streams, and singing birds, her interest centers in human beings, their sorrows, joys, loves, and marriages. In the beauty of her thoughts, in melodious verse, and intensity of feeling, she scarcely has an equal in literature. But the Athenians of later time, who could not appreciate freedom and high intelligence in women, gave her a bad reputation, and their judgment prevailed till modern scholarship succeeded in vindicating her character. Choral lyrics. The poems of Sappho, like those of Alcaeus, were personal lyrics. Meanwhile, other poets were engaged in composing choral lyrics which were essentially public. This kind of ode was sung by a group of persons appropriately dressed and trained, who accompanied the song with a rhythmic movement or dance. The equipment and training involved expense borne by a wealthy person, or, more commonly, by the state. The ode was expected to express, accordingly, not the feelings of the writer alone, but of the whole community. In Greece there was no sharp distinction, such as now exists, between society and state. The citizens were mostly known to one another, and the reunions of kinsmen, neighbors, phratries, and of the entire community in festivals were not only social, but religious and civic functions. These circumstances explain the existence of a form of poetry which was at one and the same time religious, social, and civic. Arising from unpolished folk songs, they gradually developed an artistic character in the hands of skilled composers. They were most at home in the Doric states, especially in Lacedaemon, where the government aimed to regulate communal life, so to speak, in a harmonious rhythm. Among a people delicately sensitive to sights and sounds, the patriotic and moral appeal was made less to the intellect than to the eye and ear. The best known among the earlier masters of choral song was Alcman of Lacedaemon, whose poems have already been cited. He is most celebrated for his Parthenia, choral songs for girls. There were similar odes for grown women, boys, and men respectively, presented at the religious festivals of the state. The form of ode which contained the germ of the drama will be spoken of in other connections, whereas the treatment of Pindar, the greatest of choral lyrists, with his contemporary Bacchylides, belongs to a later period. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Intellectual Awakening, 750 to 479. Part 2. Religious, Moral, and Scientific Progress. Origin of Religion and the Worship of the Dead. The most obvious, and perhaps the most primitive, origin of religion is the phenomenon of sleep and dreams. The body is the principal self, but along with it is the soul, a shadow or image of the body. While the real self is unconscious in sleep, the shadow double communes with other souls and foresees the future. Death is closely akin to sleep. The body decays or is burned, but the soul survives with hunger and thirst, and with a power at least to annoy. These conditions account for the worship of the dead. Thence a childlike imagination peopled the world with similar spirits, whose like demands created the worship of natural objects and forces. A social origin of religion. The growth of these ideas was reinforced by deeper experiences of the soul. Men were conscious of possessing powers, which they vaguely confused with the forces of nature. Personal emotions or powers were greatly intensified by becoming social, when felt or exerted by a group of human beings accustomed to a common life. Their sacred dance or other collective ceremony wrought magically upon nature in the interest of the group. Doubtless it was this social emotion, whose power surpassed the individual comprehension, which led them to believe in the existence of a spirit, demon, of the group or community. He was a being like a human, though generally invisible and working with greater mystery and power, whose life was bound up with that of his community. When a demon came to be conceived as independent of its natural object or force or social group, or when it acquired a definite personality, it became a god. To maintain relations with either of these beings, a social group founded an altar to him, and instituted a ritual for his worship, watched over by priest or priestess, whose office was sometimes hereditary, sometimes elective. The chief element of the ritual was a sacrifice, a meal partaken of in good fellowship by the god and his worshippers. There were also prayers, hymns, dances, and the presentation of gifts, votive offerings, for the adornment of the shrine. In the imagination of the worshippers, the deities generally took the form of men and women, though taller, stronger, and more beautiful. Heroes and communal deities. Usually the spirits of the dead were worshipped by the family at its tombs. Heroes were the more powerful spirits of men who had been great on earth, the founders of cities or other mighty benefactors of their kind. Every association of men as a gens, phratry, deme, or tribe, in addition to other deities, had its name-giving hero, the real or fictitious ancestor of the group. Every state had especial guardian deities, worshipped by all the citizens. Each of these gods enjoyed an independent existence. The Athena or Zeus of a given locality or phratry or state was a personal being distinct from every other Athena or Zeus. Myth, original and derived meaning. Originally, myth was the expression of a religious idea or emotion in the form of a story created by a fresh, childlike imagination. As the Greek mind in the course of development began to look for the causes of usages, institutions, and of the world itself, it was for a time satisfied with myths. These stories, however, never became dogmas among the Greeks, but remained plastic, freely molded to suit the poet's fancy or the genealogist's purpose. The Temple. In Minoan time, the chief deity dwelt in a chapel of the palace, and during the Middle Ages he was content with a modest shelter for himself and his movable goods. In the course of the 6th and 7th centuries, all the more important gods came to be housed in well-built, artistic dwellings. The simplest form was the temple in Antis, whose cella and vestibule preserved the main elements of the Homeric palace. Thence developed the double temple in Antis, which for greater beauty and for the shelter of worshippers might be surrounded by a peristyle. In this case it is termed peripteral. There grew up as a distinct type the prostyle temple, whose vestibule was fronted by a row of columns. A development from the latter type is the amphiprostyle temple, which, too, might be made peripteral. The temples of Greece and her western colonies were prevailingly of the Doric order, a growth from Minoan elements. The earlier examples of this order give an impression of sturdiness and substantiality, gradually transformed into gracefulness with increasing height and slenderness of the columns and the diminution of the curves. A new element of beauty was added when, toward the end of the 6th century, the Greeks of certain places began to use marble instead of the earlier limestone. Earliest metopes. The most ancient stone temples have fallen to ruin, but the metopes from one of the earliest, at Selinus, Sicily, near the close of the 7th century, may be seen in the Museum of Palermo. In the sculptural groups that adorn them, the lines are monotonously parallel, the human forms are disproportionate, the attitudes are rigid, and yet a certain freshness and originality stamp the work as Greek. Advance in art under the Pisistratidae, 560 to 510. In the age of the Pisistratidae, a great advance was made throughout Hellas in architecture as well as in other arts, and the patron of those tyrants was directed to bringing Athens abreast of the general progress. From the islands of the Aegean Sea, artists flocked to Athens to paint vases, build temples, and chisel reliefs and statues to satisfy the improving taste of the community. In honor of Athena, patron goddess of the city, Pisistratus surrounded her temple on the Acropolis with a peristyle. The limestone of the building was stuccoed and painted in brilliant colors, dominantly red and blue, in the fashion of the age. For the first time at Athens, marble was used in architecture. The metope and pediment sculptures of the Athena temple were of that material, imported from Paros. Among the other works of these tyrants, we may merely mention the gigantic temple to the Olympian Zeus, founded by them beside the Ilissus, to be completed 6 centuries later by the Emperor Hadrian. The older Parthenon. Emulating the tyrant's zeal for building, the party of Cleisthenes, after the completion of his reforms, began a new and more splendid temple to Athena on the Acropolis, south of the existing shrine, on the site afterward occupied by the Parthenon. Unlike the old temple, it was to be of Pentelic marble. For the site they first constructed a terrace for leveling the southern slope of the Acropolis, and placed thereon the foundation. Many marble drums, too, for the temple had been conveyed from Pentelicus, when the invasion of Xerxes cut short the work, till it could be resumed years after by Pericles. The pre-Persian building is known as the Older Parthenon. Statues, especially of women. Religion expressed itself not only in the temple with its sculptured decorations, but also in statues, whether of the deity or his worshippers, or of famous athletes or of benefactors of the state. A common material was wood, and the most revered image of Athena on the Acropolis, even in the period of highest artistic development, remained a mere log with human features crudely indicated. Equally early, doubtless, was the use of soft limestone, from which, about 600, the artists passed to marble. Most primitive is the statue of a woman found at Delos, in representing Artemis, or a worshipper of that goddess. It is a marble block with the roughest suggestion of a woman's form and dress. The advance made within the 6th century may be estimated by comparing one of the maiden statues dedicated to Athena on the Acropolis, no long time before the Persian War. Though slightly stiff and conventional, the form shows a noteworthy gain in grace and naturalness, and the drapery is delicately elaborated. The air of refined luxury which surrounds this Athenian lady is doubtless an importation from Ionia, whence the softer elements of civilization came to the Greek peninsula. The statues of athletes. In the series of Apollos extending through the 6th century, we may trace the development of the nude form of the youthful athlete. The original type seems strongly Egyptian, the posture is rigid, the only deviation from strict frontality is a slight advance of the left foot, perhaps to suggest walking. As in the earlier women's statues, the arms are attached to the sides, and the bodies show little knowledge of anatomy. But we can trace a steady advance through the series, and at the beginning of the following period we shall find a marvelous mastery of athletic form and posture. In contrast with the Orientals, the Greeks like to display the unclad forms of men both in life and in art. This predilection contributed vastly to the development of naturalness in art and to a true appreciation of human physical perfection, involving a respect for the dignity of the body wholly foreign to the Orient. Reasons for the rapid advance of sculpture. Having begun in the 7th century with a skill far inferior to that of the contemporary Egyptian, the Greek sculptor rapidly brought his art abreast of the general progress of Hellenic culture. This success was largely due to his willingness, while learning all his predecessors could teach, to study external nature and the human form continually anew, and quite as much to his constant effort to express in art the best thought and the noblest aspiration of his age. Hence it results that the material he has left us, fragmentary as it is, forms a most valuable source of our knowledge of the Hellenic character. Festivals. The Panathenaea. The gods required for their own happiness not only beautiful temples decorated with reliefs, statues, and paintings, but also festivals wherein the citizens might gladden their own hearts. A most prominent feature of Athena worship at Athens was a festival held every summer, the Panathenaea. Pisistratus ordained that every 4th year the festival was to be given as the greater Panathenaea with a special magnificence. Prisoners were set free, and slaves were permitted to feast with their masters. There were races, war dances in armor, athletic competitions, and a grand procession of all the free population, the priests and magistrates, the populace in varied festival attire, youths and girls carrying articles and utensils needed for the sacrifice. The object of the ceremony was to bring the goddess the peplos that had been woven and embroidered for her by her chosen girls. The procession passed through the streets and up the steep ascent of the Acropolis to the great altar before the temple of Athena. Pisistratus added the recitation of Homer's poems, and this new feature bore immediate fruit in introducing epic subjects into the rising art of painting and in giving an epic content to the drama, then in its earliest beginnings. From formalism to emotional worship. The tendency of all ritual is to lose its meaning and to sink into dry, barren formalism, which fails to satisfy the emotional need of mankind. This principle holds for the ceremonies of Greek worship. As their springs of emotion dried up, the void came to be filled by the worship of Dionysus. His cult, as some assert, may have survived among the peasants of the Minoan age. At all events, in the 7th and 6th centuries, it received a new impetus from Thrace, where the same god, or one closely like him, was venerated. The belief prevailed that in childhood he was torn to pieces by the Titans, but restored to life through rebirth. The half-human, suffering, ever-youthful god, the spirit of life in nature and man, awakener of joys, appealed directly to the emotions. Throngs of worshippers, the majority women, roamed in wild nocturnal revels over mountaintop, and danced in ecstasy to the roll of drums and the clashing of cymbals. By such means they became one with their deity, partakers of his immortal life. Orphism. In the 6th century, an effort was made to transform this unbridled worship into a theology and a church. The leaders of the new movement looked back for their master to Thracian Orpheus, who appears in story as a minstrel of wondrous power. The faith was spread by missionaries who traveled throughout Hellas, initiating converts and founding societies of worshippers. They had their sacred scriptures, containing prophecies and hymns. Adopting the worship of Dionysus, they gave it a more regular form and a higher spiritual interpretation. After the emotional rites of initiation, they lived ascetic lives. They were under the impression that the soul is suffering the punishment of sin, committed in a previous existence, and that the body is an enclosure or prison in which the soul is incarcerated. By purity of living and the practice of their rituals, however, they were able not only to cleanse themselves from sin and secure eternal happiness, but even to redeem the souls of the dead from punishment in Tartarus. Eternal happiness. Great in the coming world, they thought, will be the bliss of the righteous. Evenly ever in sunlight, night and day, an unlaborious life the good receive. Whoever have been good of courage to the abiding, steadfast thrice on either side of death, and have refrained their souls from all iniquity, travel the road of Zeus unto the tower of Cronos. There, round the islands of the blest, the ocean breezes blow, and golden flowers are glowing, some from the land on trees of splendor, and some the water feedeth, with wreaths whereof they entwine their hands. Some in horses and in bodily feats, and some in dice, and some in harp playing have delight, and among them thriveth all fair flowering bliss. It behoveth, therefore, in this life to walk in moderation, refraining from evil doing, insolence, and presumptuous thoughts. The Eleusinian Mysteries. In no state was Orphism accepted as a part of the public worship, though the Pisistratidae were warm patrons of Onomacritus, its most distinguished prophet. But Athens did not hesitate to worship Dionysus in shrines of his own, and to join him with Demeter and her daughter Persephone, the great goddesses of Eleusis. Their worship, once local in Eupatrid, had now become national, open to all Hellenes who were free from religious pollution. Once a year the devotees of these goddesses, gathering at Athens, moved in procession along the sacred way to Eleusis. Arriving there, the initiated entered the shrine, Telesterion, where were performed the sacred rites which none dared disclose. Those who wished and were qualified were initiated. The mysteries seem to have consisted chiefly of a passion play, representing the sorrows of Demeter, when her daughter was carried off by Hades, and the joy of recovering her. The ceremony probably once referred to the death of vegetation in winter and its rebirth in spring. In this period, however, it came to signify death and the resurrection of the soul to eternal happiness. O thrice blessed the mortals who have seen these mysteries before descending to Hades' realm. For those only will there be a future life of happiness. The others there will experience naught but suffering. Thus, Demeter brings the initiated the sweetest consolation at death and the hope of eternity. In this way the joys of Elysium, in Homer's conception open to the favored few, were democratized by the progress of Athens toward popular liberty and equality. Origin of the drama and the dramatic festivals at Athens. In addition to a share in the Eleusinian festival, Dionysus had his own holidays, connected with the culture of the vine, for his was the ecstasy, too, of the wine cup. As his worship developed, many festivals, in honor of the dead, were transferred to him. In December, the villages of Attica celebrated the rural Dionysia, in which a chorus of men in rustic attire sang in his honor an unpolished but joyous song, the dithyramb. There was a festival in the city, the Lenaea, in January, and another, the Greater Dionysia, in March. Similar festivals were held in other parts of Greece. The wild strain sung to Dionysus was transformed by poetic art into a choral ode. The singing was interspersed with recitation, which gradually developed into the dialogue. Thus arose the drama. This growth was fostered by the tyrants. At the court of Periander, the lesbic poet Arion set the dithyramb to order, and at the court of Pisistratos lived Thespis, reputed the first dramatic writer. Through the encouragement of popular cults, as distinguished from those monopolized by the nobility, the tyrant aimed to free the masses from Eupatrid control and attach them to himself. For a long time, however, the drama must have continued crude and immature. Even at the close of the period, it was essentially a cantata in which the singing was occasionally interrupted by dialogue. The four great national games. All Hellenic states had their festivals similar to those of Athens. In tradition, the oldest home of competitions in athletics and music was Crete and Lacedaemon, whence they extended to the rest of Hellas. Most festivals remained confined to a single locality, or at the widest to a city-state, but in a few instances, games in honor of a local deity became, for unknown reasons, pan-Hellenic. Such were the four great national festivals celebrated at Delphi, on the Corinthian Isthmus at Nemea, and at Olympia, in honor of Apollo, Poseidon, Nemean Zeus, and Olympian Zeus, respectively. At the founding of the Olympic Games, a simple foot race sufficed, but other events were successfully added till the games included many kinds of athletic contests together with the races of horses and chariots. Especially noteworthy is the pentathlon, comprising running, wrestling, leaping, spear hurling, and discus throwing. The contestant had to be an all-around athlete, with a body symmetrically developed. In the Pythian Games, celebrated at Delphi, it was natural that the contests with the song pipe and lyre, and in singing, should be included for the honor of the god of music. There were no such competitions at Nemea or Olympia, but poet and rhetorician there found private audiences for their productions. The prize at these games was a wreath of wild olive, bay, or other leaves. The competitive struggle and the glory and inspiration of victory. The greatest of the festivals, founded, men thought, for his father Zeus by Heracles, prince of athletes, are the Olympic, whereas striving of swift feet and of strong bodies brave to labor, but he that overcometh hath, because of these contests, a sweet tranquillity throughout his life for evermore. At the close of the competition, the just judge of games, fulfilling Heracles' behests of old, lays upon the winner's hair, above his brows, pale gleaming glory of olive. Then in the night following the victory, when the mid-month moon, riding her golden car, lit full the counterflame of the eye of even, all the precinct sounded with the songs of festal glee, in honor of the victors. The triumph was celebrated further by processions to the temples and prayers of thanksgiving, by feast and choral song. The banquet loveth peace, and by a gentle song of victory flourisheth afresh, and beside the bowl the singer's voice waxeth brave. The games are, accordingly, the poet's chief inspiration. Thence cometh the glorious hymn that entereth into the minds of the skilled in song. A victory sheds its radiance over the winner's family, and adds fairest renown to his state. The influence of the games. The influence of the games did not limit itself to the promotion of physical excellence and the cultivation of music and poetry. The assembly of the Hellenes took place under a sacred truce, during which the states, ceasing from war, cultivated friendship. Merchants gathered, especially at the Isthmian festival, to display and sell their wares. Even more beneficial than the exchange of material goods and the fostering of commerce was the intercommunication of ideas and sentiments among the assembled representatives of the entire Hellenic world. This social and intellectual symposium generated a spirit of racial unity and intensified the creative genius in the fields of art and intelligence. While the victory itself inspired the poet to the composition of splendid triumphal songs, the person of the athlete furnished the sculptor with the model, as well as the motive, for the most beautiful statues. The national games accordingly influenced Greek life in manifold ways, and especially the competitive spirit penetrated and energized every constructive element of Hellenism. Divination. It was natural that a people whose life was permeated by religion should seek means of communicating with the gods. So common a use for this purpose was made of the flight of birds that the winged creature came to designate any kind of omen. An ox or an ass that may happen to pass, a voice in the street or a slave that you meet, a name or a word by chance overheard. If you deem it an omen, you call it a bird. Oracles. All such chance objects or occurrences were regarded as manifestations of the divine will. An oracle, on the other hand, had a fixed location and a definite method of expression. Although the Homeric Greeks had little knowledge of oracles, we find them widespread over Hellas in the period under consideration, and cannot doubt that some of them survived from the Minoan age. The most venerable was that of Zeus at Dodona, where the god spoke through the rustling of oak leaves. Favoring conditions, however, brought to preeminence the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. His prophetess, the Pythia, sitting on a tripod in the inmost shrine, received from Apollo the answers she gave to inquirers. Often unintelligible, her mutterings were interpreted to the inquirer by the priests of the god. The chief function of the oracle was not to reveal the future. When it made such a venture, the response was couched in ambiguous terms, so as to be right in any event. Thus he who desired more than his meat received an answer according to his folly. The god's advice was generally limited to questions of moral and religious conduct of individuals and states, for instance, as to what gods should be worshipped and with what rites on a given occasion, or by what ceremonies a pollution might be removed. Its approval was sought for the founding of colonies and for other important enterprises. Sometimes it was bribed, sometimes it showed undue favor to a particular state or political party. Notwithstanding these shortcomings, its general reputation for honesty and wisdom long retained for it the highest, though by no means absolute, authority in Hellenic morals and religion. Divination from sacrificial animals. It was not always convenient to go to an oracle, and the bird omens came to be thought extremely uncertain. A form of divination unknown to Hesiod as well as to Homer, and evidently later than their time, found its omens in the vitals of a sacrificed animal. The system seems to have been introduced from Babylonia, and was in full force in the time of the Great War with Persia. The commander of troops found this method convenient because he could easily resort to it at any time and place, and perhaps even more because the inspection of several victims in quick succession would most certainly bring omens favorable to his wishes. At last the Greeks were enabled to make divination subserve the practical intelligence. Systematic thinking about the world. Cosmogony. In the general belief, the gods, who acted under individual caprice or under the influence of prayer and sacrifice, were the causes of all things in nature and the arbiters of human destiny. In the beginning, the clashing of divine wills wrought chaos in heaven and on earth, till the dawning consciousness of moral and physical unity and order led the poets to devise a system into which all existing things might have a due part. With their conception of the gods in human form, it was but natural that they should attempt to explain the multitude of deities, as of men, and even the plurality of all natural objects, by the one process of birth. A system so devised is a cosmogony. Hesiod, our earliest exponent of this line of thought, assumes the creation, he does not say how, of chaos, then earth. From chaos sprang Erebos and black night, and from night in turn sprang bright ether and day. And earth bare starry heaven, Ouranos, to the end that there might be for the blessed gods a habitation steadfast forever. The youngest son of earth and heaven was Cronos of crooked counsels, of all her children most terrible. The supremacy of Zeus. We need not numerate the hosts of supernatural beings thus generated, of monstrous or lovely form, deadly or beneficent, but may pass on to the birth of Zeus, son of Cronos. When he grew to manhood in the rich island of Crete, he conquered the Titans and other monstrous beings, and himself reigned supreme. He was king in heaven, himself holding the thunder and the smoking thunderbolt, having by his might overcome his father Cronos. And he duly appointed their portions unto all the deathless gods alike, and declared unto them their honors. From cosmogony to science, aid from Egypt. In this way, the poet thought, came unity, system, and order from chaos. With the accumulation of knowledge and the growth of an inquiring spirit, however, the Hellenes would not satisfy themselves with such childlike reasoning. It was but natural that the next step should be taken by the Ionians, the most enterprising and inventive of the Greeks. Among them were men who visited Egypt and perhaps other parts of the Orient, not merely for trade, but also for sightseeing and instruction. Among them was Thales of Miletus. In Egypt, they learned such elementary science as the priests cultivated, especially arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. The development of these branches of knowledge, together with the elements of architecture and civil engineering, had been made possible only by the organized priesthoods of Egypt and Babylonia. This knowledge consisted purely of facts ascertained by experience and arbitrarily classified, but wanting the elements of reason and demonstration. Hence it was far from science in the present sense of the word. The contribution of the Hellenic mind, brilliantly imaginative and untrammeled by religious or other convention, was to pierce beneath the fact to the underlying cause, and thus to create real science. The first step in this process, taken by Thales, marks him as the founder, not merely of Greek science, but in the only true sense of the term, of the world's science. Thales of Miletus, early 6th century. Though we cannot be sure that everything ascribed to Thales of Miletus was really his work, there is no doubt that he contributed greatly to mathematics and astronomy. The story that while stargazing he fell into a well is told to illustrate the impracticability of the philosopher. The moral thus pointed, however, is nullified by another story that he speculated in olives on his foreknowledge of the weather and reaped great profit from the transaction. It may well be that he foretold the eclipse of the sun, which occurred on May 28, 585, though it hardly seems possible that his knowledge enabled him to fix the very day and hour. Thales's philosophic theory, its value. However that may be, his fame rests not upon any individual scientific discovery, but upon his new conception of cause. Accepting from the poets the idea of the unity of things and the necessity of causation, he sought for cause not among the gods, but in nature itself. Water, he declared, was the one source and substance of all things. In his statement, too, that the world is full of gods, he seems to mean that things contain in themselves the conscious power to create other things. Although not wholly free from the influence of mythology, and wrong in choosing a material substance as his first principle, yet in displacing the gods by natural causation, he took the all-important step from mythology and theology to science and philosophy. Within the historical period, this change has proved the most momentous revolution in the intellectual history of mankind. The Ionic School, Anaximander, middle of the 6th century. The Ionic school of philosophy, thus founded by Thales, sought the first principle in matter. He left no writings, but a pupil, Anaximander, published a scientific treatise, probably the first prose work in the Greek language. His principle was the unlimited, evidently a boundless reservoir from which all things come and to which everything returns. In opposition to the poets, he thought out a mechanical process for explaining the formation and ultimate destruction of the existing world, in fact of an unending succession of worlds. Evolution it could not be called. Our present earth, he taught, is a cylinder, whose upper surface we inhabit. This idea, too, is an advance beyond the earlier conception of the world as a round flat disk. From information gathered by Ionian navigators, he made the first map of the earth, and hence may be regarded as the earliest geographer. Pythagoras. The further history of this school need not concern us here. A newer and deeper meaning was given to philosophy by Pythagoras of Samos, who in the latter half of the 6th century migrated to Croton, Italy, 522. Learned in mathematics of the Ionian school, he sought in numbers the primary cause of all things, whether musical harmonies, stellar movements, the nature of the gods, or even abstract ideas. This attention to numbers gave a great impetus to the study of mathematics, hence to exactness in science, but it was marred by his attaching to numbers mystical powers alien to true science. In fact, Pythagoras is distinguished as a mystic and a moral reformer even more than for his contribution to science. With the Orphists, he believed in the transmigration of souls. Their attainment to a higher condition in a future existence depended on moral conduct in this. The chief aim of Pythagoras seems to have been a life of moral purity, to which philosophy, religion, and mystic initiations were merely contributory. His school was a secret association which extended to most of the cities of southern Italy. It cultivated dietetics and medicine. It enjoined a life of moral discipline and self-restraint. Taking a political turn and acquiring the rule over many states, these societies endeavored to manage affairs according to their ethical standard. We must regard the organization as an element, both product and factor, in the deepening religious and moral sense of the period, now under consideration. Xenophanes, 572 to 480. A further advance in these general philosophic and ethical directions was made by Xenophanes of Colophon, who immigrated to Elea, Italy, whence the school he founded is known as Eleatic. He indignantly assails the Homeric conception of the gods as beings of human form, who lie and steal and commit other such sins as would shame the race of men. Beings of this kind are the creation of human fancy. The real God is one, like man, neither in form nor thought. He is all eye, all mind, all ear. He controls all things without labor by the power of his thought. He is eternal, unchangeable, and spiritual. Here seems to be the enunciation of a pure monotheism. It is clear, too, that this thinker's interest centers in moral improvement. He chides his fellow citizens of Colophon for having adopted the luxurious habits of the Lydians. They throng the marketplace by thousands, in purple gowns, with hair well adorned, their bodies dripping with fragrant oils. It is the duty of sensible men, when they gather at banquets, to pray God to give us power to do justice. His God, therefore, is a moral force, and the author of the poems cited here is as much theologian and moral reformer as philosopher. He could look forward with good hope, believing that the powers have not revealed to men all things from the beginning, but that mortals, by searching gradually, found out the better. Improved conceptions of virtue. Intellectual progress connected itself on one side with advancing religion, on the other with moral development. A better conception of virtue arose. It was no longer physical perfection or the free gift of the gods, as in Homer, but had come to mean especially moral excellence, which men had to strive for. It is hard to be a worthy man now seems trite, but was then a fresh, stimulating truth. To maintain his character, one had to exercise self-restraint, sophrosony. This was a new word in the Greek vocabulary, yet one involving the most imperative of Hellenic commandments. It was no small gain that in this struggle for moral improvement, man should now have the gods as helpers, better examples of purity and right than those of Homer, and demanding in the worshipper clean hands and an upright heart. Improvements in domestic and in interstate law. Moral progress showed itself in the better safeguarding of domestic peace by the establishment of competent courts for homicide and the abolition of the blood feud, by the improvement in the condition of women, involving the abolition of marriage by capture and purchase, and in the better protection of the masses from the brutality of aristocratic rule. In interstate relations, piracy, once creditable, had fallen into disgrace and was greatly limited by the rise of naval powers. In place of those undefined relations between states which, void of treaty and diplomatic representation, constantly tempted to hostilities, written truces, usually for a definite number of years, were substituted and proved an invaluable aid to peace. Often states submitted their disputes to arbitration, and in all the known cases of this period, both parties accepted the decision. More primitive in character, though but little less humane, was the custom of settling controversies through the battle of champions, still occasionally employed. Generally captives were not massacred as in earlier time, but held for ransom, or at the worst enslaved. The bodies of the dead were no longer mutilated or left a prey to dogs and birds, but were given back by the victors under a truce. As a rule, however, Greeks showed far greater humanity toward their own race than toward foreigners, whom they contemptuously termed barbarians. In brief, a body of Hellenic law was developing, which, under religious sanctions, regulated the relations among the states of Hellas. Multiplication of ethical proverbs. Examples of ethical truths may be found in the moral proverbs of the 7 sages, among whom were Thales and Solon. Know thyself, everything in moderation, it is hard to be a good man, and other such proverbs attributed to them were accepted as inspired rules of life. Hesiod is the first who collected a moral code, and after him the elegiac and lyric poets abound in moral saws. In fact, the Greeks had come to be a moralizing people. Doubtless such proverbs were a great aid to write. Briefly, it may be said that throughout this period, legislator, poet, scientific thinker, and practical sage, in their several ways, were exerting themselves for the moral improvement of mankind. The beginnings of historical thought. It remains to notice the view at this time coming to be taken of mankind's past. Little detail is given of the creation of human beings. Hesiod simply informs us of the golden race, which the immortals originally produced, a race that knew no toil or sorrow or death, but passed away in sleep to become good spirits, eternal guardians of mortal men. Then ensued a silver race of inferior men acquainted with sin and grief. Then a brazen race, warlike and insolent, slain by one another's hands, went down to the realm of Hades. Then came the juster race of heroes, who having fought round Troy, were gathered to the islands of the blest. Lastly arose the race of iron, among whom the poet lived. Neither by day shall there ever cease from weariness and woe, neither in the night from wasting, and sore cares shall the gods give them. The idea of an original golden age of moral purity and physical perfection from which mankind fell has a large place in the history of ancient thought. How the Greeks view the origin of their race. As to their own race, the Greeks of this period claim to trace it from Prometheus, the heroic friend of man. His son was Deucalion, who with his wife Pyrrha were alone saved at the time of the great flood. They were the parents of Helen, the eponym of the Hellenes. It was not until the time of Hesiod that the Greeks had become sufficiently conscious of their ethnic unity to group themselves thus under a single name. Helen's sons were Doris, Xuthos, and Aeolus. By assuming that Xuthos had two sons, Achaeus and Ion, the Greeks of this period accounted for the names of the four races, Dorians, Achaeans, Ionians, and Aeolians, most prominent in early Hellenic history. Such eponyms were originally considered ancestors of their races, but came in time to be regarded as kings. The beginnings of historical and geographical literature. The process of weaving genealogies did not stop at the point above mentioned. Founders of cities, ruling dynasties, and individual gentes had all to trace their pedigrees back to some hero, and through him to one of the greater gods. In an aristocratic society, it was but natural that the interest in the past should center in pedigrees and project itself beyond recent generations to the beginnings of races and families. Among the genealogy mongers, who swarmed in every city, were a few who committed their results to writing. The earliest genealogist known to us by name was Cadmos of Miletus, a contemporary of Anaximander, and author of the Settlement of Ionia, about 550. The first genealogies to survive the present day are those of Acusilaus of Argos, about 500. Such authors were described as logographi, writers of prose. They merely converted into prose, extended, and systematized the existing genealogical epics. They were the brood of Hesiod, with the wings of their imagination clipped by the limitations of prose, with reason wider awake, with a nascent critical power. The most eminent of the class was Hecataeus of Miletus, who took an active part in public affairs during the Ionian Revolt. His genealogies must have contained, in addition to myths, some historical information, and his Description of the Earth was for its day a geography of distinguished merit. An awakening consciousness of the distinction between myth and fact is proved by his own words. I write what I believe to be true, for the various stories of the Hellenes are, in my opinion, ridiculous. The logography, among whom he is numbered, were the connecting link between epic poetry and history, owing the equipment of their minds to the intellectual progress of the 6th century. The children of Hesiod, so to speak, and schoolfellows with the earliest philosophers. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10. Conquest of the Asiatic Greeks by the Lydians and the Persians, 560 to 493. Characteristic of Ionian political history, It is a strange yet characteristic fact that the growth of the brilliant Ionian culture reviewed in the preceding chapters was accompanied, as cause and effect, by continued wars among the states which produced this splendid, versatile life, and by fiercer factional struggles within the individual cities. One example of internal conflict will suffice. In Milesian territory, the tillers of the soil were Gergothai, a class of serfs who rebelled against their lords, and gaining the upper hand but momentarily, collected the young children of their masters on threshing floors, and crushed them under the hoofs of oxen. Regaining control, the lords smeared the captive Gergothai with pitch and burnt them alive. So deadly was the antipathy of classes. Everywhere the primitive kingship had passed away. In some states aristocracy survived, in others democracy had gained the upper hand, but in the general internal weakness the republics were giving way, one after another, to tyranny, civil discord and interstate warfare, while stimulating the mind to intense productivity rendered the Asiatic Greeks wholly unfit to defend themselves against foreign aggression. Lydia and the Anatolian Greeks. The need of united action increased with the growth of Lydia in the interior of Asia Minor to a strong aggressive power under King Gyges about 660. That country was rich in gold, and the inhabitants, by manufacturing and by overland trade with Asia, had accumulated great wealth. The delicacies of their life, however, afforded little hindrance to the policy of conquest adopted by Gyges. It was probably in resistance to Lydian aggression that 12 cities of Ionia joined in a league, whose centre was the Panionion, a shrine of Poseidon on the promontory of Mycale. In a spirit of exclusiveness, they styled themselves groundlessly the only true Ionians, and would admit no other states to their union. The Aeolians and the Dorians of Asia Minor formed similar leagues, but the idea of inviting all the Asiatic Greeks under a single government seems to have occurred to no one. On critical occasions, the deputies of the allied Ionian states met at the Panionion to deliberate on the common welfare, but the central government possessed no means of enforcing harmonious or efficient action. Lydian conquest of the Greeks. Under these circumstances, Gyges succeeded in taking Colophon, one of their cities. The conquest was completed by Croesus, a later king, about 560 to 546, who incorporated the Greeks of the Asiatic coast in his realm. Miletus alone, which had taken no part in the resistance, remained an ally under treaty. In far earlier times the Lydians had given the Greeks their useful arts, and were now adopting the Hellenic culture. Though differing in language, the two peoples were coming therefore to possess essentially the same civilization, and were closely allied in commercial and social intercourse. Croesus made the burden of his tribute on the Greeks light and favoured their shrines with rich votive offerings. Under him, Lydia reached the height of her prosperity and attained to the magnitude of an empire. To the tributes which poured in from all the peoples west of the Halys River was added a rich gold revenue from the sands of the Pactolus. Relying on his material resources, the prosperous king made ready to contend with the Persian Empire, newly arisen on his eastern border. The Assyrian Empire to 606. From about the beginning of the Middle Age, the great power of Asia had been Assyria. Early in the 7th century, she had conquered Egypt. After this event, her empire extended from above Memphis on the Nile nearly to the Caspian Sea, and from the Persian Gulf to the Black Sea. This was the first conquering state to follow a systematic policy of organization. She divided her subject territories into provinces, satrapies, each under a governor or satrap. Appointed by the Assyrian king, the functions of the satrap were military, judicial, and general administrative, including a supervision of the tributes. Under him were native kings, who enjoyed far less freedom than had been possible in earlier and more loosely organized empires. It was also the policy of the central government to transplant great numbers of the newly conquered from one part of the empire to another, with a view to uprooting local patriotism and of making the subject peoples more dependent. A state so thoroughly predatory in its aims is doomed sooner or later to decay. Thus it happened that in 606, the Assyrian capital Nineveh was taken by a combination of the highly civilized Babylonians with the Medes a fresh, virile Indo-European people. The Median and the Persian empires, 605 to 546. Thence arose two empires, the Babylonian on the south of Asia, and the Median in the north. The latter included Persia, and by rapid conquest extended its western border to the Halys River. With this boundary the Medes might have been satisfied, but suddenly, 550, their king was overthrown by an uprising of the Persians under Cyrus. This revolution, making the Median Empire Persian, placed in control a still more vigorous, aggressive Indo-European race of mountaineers under a leader of extraordinary genius and ambition. Cyrus defeated Croesus in 2 battles, seized Sardis, his capital, and took the proud king captive. Lydia became a part of the Persian Empire, 546. The Persian conquest of the Anatolian Greeks, 546 to 538. The Aeolians and Ionians were loath to exchange their benevolent king for the new Persian conqueror. Having treated his messengers coldly at the beginning of the war, they now sought from him the same terms of subjection as they had received from Croesus. He refused, whereupon they began to wall their towns, and calling a council at the Panionion, the Ionians resolved to ask the aid of Sparta, now the strongest power in Greece. The Lacedaemonians could not think of so distant an enterprise. It is said, however, that they sent an embassy to warn Cyrus at his peril not to harm any city of Hellas. The Persian king treated the message with contempt. Harpagus, his lieutenant, entrusted with the work of conquering the Greeks, laid siege to their cities one by one and captured them. Unwilling to submit, the Phaeacians sailed away in a body to find a colony in Corsica. In like manner, the people of Teos, abandoning their city, founded Abdera in Thrace. The rest of the Ionians, with the exception of the Milesians, who had allied themselves with Cyrus, submitted, and most of the neighbouring islands followed their example. Gradually, all Asia Minor was conquered and incorporated in the Persian Empire. Meantime, after conquering Babylon, Cyrus met death in battle with the barbarians on his northeastern frontier. Darius, 521 to 485. Organization of the empire. During the reign of Cambyses, son and successor of Cyrus, 529 to 522, the Persians made no great extension of their territory to the west, but directed themselves mainly to the acquisition of Egypt. Cambyses died by a self-inflicted wound, and after a brief interval, Darius, a distant relative, came to the throne. This king is famous chiefly for his organization of the empire. Enlarging on a policy begun by Cyrus, he divided the entire area, excepting Persia, into 20 large satrapies. The Persian satrap had essentially the same functions as the Assyrian officer of that title had formerly exercised. Naturally, the king interfered at will in all local affairs. A necessary element of control is to be found in the splendid system of well-kept roads, which Darius built from his capital Susa to all important points on the frontier. The king's eye, a near relative of the sovereign invested with great dignity and military power, served as a royal inspector. Not only the roads, but also an excellent system of gold and silver coins favoured the growth of commerce. At the same time, Darius took great pains to preserve internal peace and protect his empire from invasion. The government was less predatory in aim than that of Assyria, and we find in Darius a rare benevolence towards his subjects. The place of the Greeks in the empire. All the Greeks on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, together with some neighbouring peoples, constituted the Ionian satrapy. It was placed under an officer who, from his capital Sardis, governed also the Lydian satrapy. The Asiatic Greeks paid tribute to the Persian king, as they formerly had to Croesus. In addition, they were required to perform military and naval service. The conqueror did not interfere with their religion or their habits of life or their city organizations, but everywhere set up tyrants devoted to himself. The Greeks, however, were no longer the favoured people of their king. In fact, no cultural or religious sympathies were possible between Hellenes and Persians, a far less civilized people, whose religion knew no images or gay festivities, but consisted in an internal warfare between good and evil. Greeks, too, were humiliated by their insignificant place in a gigantic empire, which embraced the East Mediterranean countries and extended into India and Central Asia. Their land forces marched with the motley army of Asiatics, and their fleets were arrayed with those of Phoenicia and Egypt under offices of the king. Their new position gave them internal peace, protection from enemies, and the advantage of commerce with the Orient by land and sea, but irritated their pride and repressed their genius, which could only thrive in freedom. Invasion of Europe by Darius, about 513. The empire was exposed on the northwestern frontier to the raids of the nomad Scythians, who occupied the region north of the Black Sea. After trying in vain to check the inroads, Darius seems to have conceived the idea of attacking these restless enemies in their rear, from the European side, and perhaps of conquering them in a return march through their country. If so, he must have greatly underrated the difficulties of the expedition. However that may be, he led a great army across the Bosphorus on a bridge of boats prepared for by a Samian architect. Thence he marched to the Danube, which he crossed on a similar bridge made from the fleets of the Ionian tyrants. As the Scythians would not meet Darius in open battle, but harassed his army interminably, and as provisions and water were insufficient, the invasion of Scythia ended in disaster. With great loss, Darius retreated into Asia. One of his generals, however, Megabazus, left behind with 80,000 men, conquered the Thracian coast from the Propontis to the Strymon River. Relations between Persia and Athens. The positive result of the Scythian expedition was accordingly the conquest by Darius of a part of European Hellas. There could be no doubt that the Persians, following their usual policy, would endeavour to continually to push their boundary forward in this direction. The people of the Greek mainland, who most sensitively felt the approaching danger, were the Athenians, for their two colonies in the Hellespontic region, Sigium and Chersonesus, were now lost to them through Persian aggression. They knew too that their exiled tyrant Hippias, now at Sigium, but hoping to be restored through Persian aid, was doing his utmost to persuade Artaphernes, satrap of Sardis, to an expedition against Athens. When some years earlier the Athenians had expelled their tyrant and had restored a republican form of government, they were assailed by the Peloponnesians. Under these circumstances, they had sent ambassadors to Sardis to seek an alliance with Persia. Artaphernes expressed his willingness on condition of their giving Darius earth and water, the tokens of submission. They agreed, but on returning home they were severely censured, and their promise was repudiated. Hearing now of the machinations of Hippias, they sent a second embassy to counteract his influence. Artaphernes abruptly ordered them to receive Hippias back, if they wished to escape ruin. Thereupon the Athenians, who had no idea of accepting the proposal, felt that a state of war existed between them and Persia. Causes of the Ionic Revolt. Aristogras at Sparta. No long time afterward, Aristogras, tyrant of Miletus, took advantage of party strife in Naxos to attempt the conquest of that island. By holding out great promises, he enlisted the aid of Artaphernes. The enterprise failed, and the tyrant could only expect the severest punishment for his broken word. His sole way of escape led through revolt. To him it was clear that the Asiatic Greeks were chafing under Persian rule, and ready on the slightest pretext for liberty. Hecataeus, the historian and geographer, warned them of the overwhelming superiority of Persia. They paid him no heed, but readily followed Aristogras in revolt. The Ionic Revolt, 499 to 494. Aristogras at Sparta. Abdicating his tyranny and accepting a constitutional office, Aristogras proceeded to overthrow the despots in the remaining Ionic cities. All Ionia was soon free from tyranny and committed to a hopeless rebellion. Aristogras went personally to Lacedaemon to ask for an alliance. Herodotus represents him as appealing to King Cleomenes in the following terms: that the sons of the Ionians should be slaves instead of free is a reproach, and grief most of all indeed to ourselves, but of all others most to you, inasmuch as ye are the leaders of Hellas. Now therefore I entreat you by gods of Hellas to rescue from slavery the Ionians, who are your own kinsmen. And ye may easily achieve this thing, for the barbarians are not brave in fight, whereas ye have attained to the highest point of valour in war. Furthermore, their fighting is with bows and arrows and a short spear, and they go into battle wearing trousers. For this reason, they are easily conquered. Then in detail, he pointed out on the map he had brought with him the road from the Ionian coast to Susa, and described the wealth that would fall to the conqueror. Cleomenes, an ambitious king, seems to have been personally favourable to the undertaking, but the Lacedaemonians could not think of so distant an expedition. The arguments and bribes of the smooth Ionian were accordingly rejected. Aristogras at Athens. Thereupon Aristogras went to Athens, where he found conditions more favourable to himself. Losses of territory and the threats of Artaphernes had stirred the Athenians to anger. Furthermore, the men who supported the reforms of Cleisthenes, who hated tyranny and stood loyally for the independence of the city, forming what we may describe as the Republican Party, were willing to try the issue of war with Persia. It was better to fight at a distance and with allies than to bear alone the shock of inevitable invasion. Their kinship and commercial relations with Ionia led them in the same direction. They resolved therefore to send 20 ships, which were reinforced by 2 from Eretria. Looking upon the war as a foolhardy undertaking, Herodotus bitterly complains that it was easier for Aristogras to deceive 30,000 Athenians than 1 Spartan, and that the ships dispatched to the war proved to be the beginning of evils for the Hellenes and the barbarians. The burning of Sardis 498. The crews of these vessels joined with the Ionians in an attack on Sardis. They burned the city, but failing to take the citadel, they were forced to retreat. On their way to the coast, they were overtaken and defeated by the Persians at Ephesus. Thereupon the Athenians returned home and would have nothing more to do with the war. This conduct proves not fickleness of purpose, but the defective character of the popular assembly as an instrument for the management of foreign relations. The friends of Hippias were always numerous, and the change of a few timid votes from the Republican to the Tyrannist party was sufficient to give the latter the control. As the Republicans were ready for war, the Tyrannists were eager for peace. The defeat at Lade, 497, its effect on Athens. The burning of Sardis encouraged the revolt, which rapidly spread to all western Asia Minor, Thrace, and Cyprus. At the same time, it roused Darius to extraordinary efforts for the suppression of the rebellion. The decisive battle was fought off Lade near Miletus between the Greek and Phoenician fleets, 353 against 600 ships, according to Herodotus. Shirking the drill necessary to efficient action, the Greeks preferred to waste their time in the shade. Discipline and united action were therefore impossible. Many Greeks listened to secret overtures from their exiled tyrant, now with the enemy, and the result was inevitably utter ruin. If this battle was fought in 497, we can understand the feeling which the news of defeat excited at Athens. Reconciliation with Persia seemed a necessity. The Tyrannist party was so strengthened that it elected to the archonship for 496 Hipparchus, a kinsman of Hippias. This was a step towards recalling the tyrant. Siege of Miletus, 494. Meantime, the Persians had laid close blockade to Miletus. After a long siege, they captured and sacked the city. After killing most of the men, they transplanted the rest of the population, in Asiatic style, to the mouth of the Tigris. In another year, the entire rebellion was suppressed. In many instances, cities were plundered and destroyed, and the remnants of the population carried into captivity. Significance of the fall of Miletus. It would be difficult to overrate the significance of these events. For centuries, the Ionians had been the standard bearers of the world's civilization. Miletus, the home of commerce and industry, and of the fine arts of poetry and science, the most brilliant city in Hellas, was blotted out of existence. Since the decay of the Minoan civilization, human progress had not experienced so severe a blow. Fortunately, however, other minds and hands were ready to take up the thought and skill of Ionia, and to carry it to a far higher reach of perfection. Effect of the event on Athens. It is worthwhile for us to notice how sensitive was the political atmosphere of Athens to the happenings across the sea. When Phrynichus had composed a drama called The Capture of Miletus and had put it on the stage, The spectators fell to weeping, and the Athenians fined the poet 1,000 drachmas on the ground that he had reminded them of their own misfortunes, and they ordered that in future no one should present this drama. To them heretofore the thought of submission to Persia had meant no more than tyranny and the payment in tribute. The poet made them vividly see the horrors which attended the Persian triumph over a city of kindred blood, and which surely impended over themselves. They would have no more tyrannous politics. In this frame of mind they elected to the archonship for 493-2 an uncompromising advocate of war for the defence of the Republic, a man of marvellous energy and mental resources, Themistocles. Themistocles, Archon, 493-2. He belonged to the gens of the Lycomidae, highly reverenced for its priestly functions, though hitherto without political importance. His father, Neocles, was probably a merchant, and Themistocles was himself accounted a keen man of business. An obstacle in his way was the circumstance that he laid out for himself a political path which coincided with the aims of neither the tyrannists nor the republicans, the two great parties of the time. His support came from mercantile class, who were in a better position than others to appreciate his aims, and from the masses, in whose hearts his patriotism awakened a responsive echo. For the control of the sea, Piraeus. At this early date he seems to have understood the weak point in any effort of Persia to conquer Greece. The country was too barren to feed an invading army large enough to crush the liberty-loving inhabitants. It would be essential therefore to the Persian king's success to keep control of the sea in order to supply his army with provisions. Themistocles saw the practicability of building a Hellenic fleet large enough to gain the supremacy of the sea. Thus Hellas would be saved and his own city raised to a towering preeminence. His year of office he devoted accordingly to improving the three natural harbours of Piraeus as a home for the great Athenian fleet of which he dreamed. He was in fact the first to call attention to the advantages of Piraeus over the open roadstead of the Phalarium with which Athenian merchants had thus far satisfied themselves. His far-reaching vision was all the more remarkable from the circumstance that during his official year the Persians were actually attempting an invasion of Greece by way of Thrace and Macedon. End of chapter 10.